Okay, so members, welcome to the 65th meeting of the Committee for Finance in this, the 22 to 27 mandate. Members, as always, the committee meeting will be recorded, broadcast throughout Parliament buildings and online. Members and those in the public gallery, put your phone on Zoom put your phone on silent or airplane mode or whatever. Okay. Agenda item 1 with no apologies. We are just about quorum at the minute. We don't have all members who said they were going to join us, so hopefully they will join us because we're sort of kind of up against quorum at the minute by one. But anyway, we have members who said they will join us on Zoom, and we await them. Agenda item 2, declaration of interest. Members are obliged to declare any relevant or other interests. Deputy Chair.
Yeah, APS, the Education Minister.
Okay, thank you. I should also declare that I was in a previous life a UK civil servant, and some of the matters that we will discuss today will, I think, touch on that and on propriety questions. So I'll just put that on the record for the sake of completeness. Okay, members, agenda item 3 is. Okay, great. We'll talk about that. Okay, grand. Agenda item 3 is chairperson's business. Now, the first bit of chairperson's business is the oral statement from the Minister on the strategic roadmap yesterday. Members, that's page 6 of the meeting pack and page 3 of the table pack. The Finance Minister made an oral statement to us yesterday regarding strategic roadmap on rating policy. So it was emailed to you yesterday. It's for members if they wish to have a comment. I have a couple of comments to make. One is with the broad policy, as to say I think we do need as a committee to keep on top of the substance of this. As I said, in a different capacity in the Chamber yesterday, I'm not clear when we are going to see progress on this, in that we know that the previous Minister announced a similar intention to act on the domestic max cap. Not only has that not happened yet, it hasn't been discussed as of yet in the Executive. So I think we need to ask the Department to provide us with clarity on when they intend to bring this to the Executive. Lots of the briefing today in the public domain appears to indicate that this is happening or it's about to happen, and without sounding too sceptical, I don't think we know it's happening yet, because a similar announcement was made on the domestic side and there's no indication of when that change will be made. It hasn't even yet been discussed at the Executive. We know it was first put to the Executive, the paper was put forward in June. I think we need to get clarity from the Department on when they anticipate those things being brought forward, because at the minute we just have a statement of a vague or a broad intention rather than an agreed policy, and I think it's important that we are clear with the public that those aren't the same things. But obviously we could even briefly raise it with the Perm Sec, but we have a lot to cover with him. The second point I wanted to raise in relation to the oral statement is one that actually touches on the propriety issues that we are about to discuss with the Permanent Secretary, and that's in relation to the timing of the oral statement that we had yesterday. It was the first item of business after member statements. It came up at just after 11 o'clock, I believe. Members, we received it, as with all other MLAs, at I believe 10:26 in our inboxes. Obviously, standing order, understand under Section 18A of standing orders, it should be at least 30 minutes before delivering a statement to the Assembly. So I'm not sure whether it was just 30 minutes or slightly under 30 minutes. But I have been made aware that there was a briefing to the press earlier in the day yesterday at 9:45. I'm also mindful of standing order of subsection 3 of standing order 18A, which says, quote, "The written copy, whether or not embargoed, shall not be given to members of the news media before it is made available to members." There was a briefing to members of the media before members of the Assembly received this oral statement, so I will be raising it with the Speaker to investigate the circumstances. Does any other member wish to come in on this? Deputy Chair.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. And yes, when there's a question of the standing orders, it would be good to raise it with the Speaker's office. Usually we do get these statements from the Department of Finance well in advance of them going out to other MLAs, so it would be good to understand if there was just a bit of a glitch here, because it has been quite unusual for them to do this. I welcomed the part of the statement where the Minister said that the strategic review would be reduced from 10 years to 2, and I would really welcome some sort of clarity on what that timeline looks like. Because to spread it over 10 years and then shorten it down to 2 is quite a lot, and effectively it'll hit the 27-28 year, which is in the next mandate. So if we could have a bit of a detail of what the planned timeline on that, it would be quite useful.
I think those are all good questions. Steve Aiken. Dr. Aiken.
Mute.
You're on mute, Steve.
His wee thing's not showing up.
Where is now?
Okay, that's us, yeah.
Go ahead, Steve.
Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Excellent. I've been unmuted now. Thank you very much indeed for unmuting me. I just want to echo what the Deputy Chair was saying, because this is unusual for I could make complaints about other ministers and timings for releasing statements, but actually they're normally very good. So just like a bit of encouragement to find out what happened. Was it a miscommunication, or was it a deliberate change? But normally the Department of Finance are very good. So I just find it unusual, and it has been noted in the Speaker's office.
Okay, yes, it will be, and I will be raising it. I think we need to establish whether this, well, first of all, to be honest, whether standing order was breached, because I do know there was a briefing with the media at 9:45, which was clearly 45 minutes before any MLA received a copy. So we need to ask the Speaker's office to investigate the circumstances, because I think that's regrettable. Okay, anyone else wish to come in on that? Grand. Okay. So, members, the next item is we are going. We are doing that.
We'll see if we can get some down to the Commissioner.
Well, we can retrospectively get them to go over the thing if needs be. Okay, members. Hansard will be joining us, we think, presently, but and if we will, I think, retrospectively get permission, if Hansard will, hoping that they will be recording this either in the room when they arrive, or subsequently using the electronic. Using the online. If members are content with that, they will record it. Okay, members, so page 8 of the meeting pack, we have correspondence from Neil Gibson setting out the parameters of the briefing we're receiving today. This is, I should have said, a briefing relating to matters that have been brought into the public domain following the Education Minister's trip to Israel and the occupied territories. That trip raised significant questions about the operation of the Civil Service Code, the propriety of that trip, but perhaps most pertinently, communications which were issued by the Department subsequently. There have been issues raised about both those communications, their adherence to the Civil Service Code, the Ministerial Code, which we are not here to discuss today, I should be clear, because it's not the purview of this Department or the officials in front of us, but also the functioning of Government Act. So, members, we felt it wasn't a unanimous decision, it should be said it was a majority decision, worthwhile to get evidence from the Department of Finance on the Civil Service Code of Ethics, the next Code of Ethics, how it is enforced, how it works, issues, how it was broad questions in relation to this example. However, I should say, members, I do not anticipate that this meeting will be used to go through absolutely all of the specific details in relation to this trip, because that was primarily for the Education Department and the Permanent Secretary to investigate and to give their view on the Education Committee. However, I do expect that the broad events of that trip will be touched on in this evidence session. So I welcome the fact that Neil Gibson, who is Permanent Secretary, is joining us, along with Catherine Shannon, who is Deputy Secretary in terms of Next HR, Aisling Quinn, Director of HR Policy, and David Hughes, who is Director of Corporate Services. I should say, members, an AQ response, which was received by me, has been circulated in hard copy for members' information. It sets out a little bit more of the Minister's response in relation to the Functioning of Government Act, which is one of the legislative provisions which people have raised questions, obviously people includes me, about. The reason we're having this briefing today is that the Department of Finance, which was of course previously the Department of Finance and Personnel, is the lead department when it comes to management of the civil service propriety and ethics, and adherence to the Civil Service Code. Obviously, it is for individual departments and indeed individual civil servants to adhere to it on an individual basis, but the enforcement of the code and how it operates in a broad sense is the work of this department. So let me say I welcome the fact that the Permanent Secretary and team have joined us today, and you've made yourselves available. I think that's to your credit. We did also copy the correspondence and the request to the head of the civil service with the offer or the suggestion that if she would like to join us, she would be more than welcome and we could find space for her. I won't draw any conclusion at this stage, but I note that she hasn't joined us, nor has she provided any further factual information on her investigation into the facts of this trip. So I just note that at this stage for the record, but we may draw further conclusions about that in due course. So, members, we're relatively tight for time, so please do keep your questions limited. Answers limited too, please, if possible. There are a couple of other issues we would like to talk about today, including questions around the internal audit returns which we've received, and also some matters in relation to recruitment, so we have a lot to get through. So we'll turn it over first of all to you, Neil, if you have an initial statement. Without being rude, please do keep it brief so we can get into questions.
Thank you, Chair, Deputy Chair, members. I am aware of my reputation of a lack of ability to be brief, so I will do my very best here.
It's a fault that I share, so don't worry, we'll be.
Yeah, delighted, and you've already introduced my colleagues, who I'm delighted to be here alongside. You've already mentioned some of the topics, won't rehearse that again. Just to say, obviously we're here on the guise of the role in which the Department of Finance has, which is in setting policies in respect of the service, the adherence to those, and behaviour underneath those sit within individual departments' responsibility. We obviously also have a service to provide should there be matters of discipline that fall out of any policy question. You've also mentioned in passing introductions there about our innovative administrative officer pilot, and we're really keen to talk to you a little bit about that. I think, as members will have heard me say before, the gravity of our financial situation is such that we're going to have to try lots of new things, and that's one of them that we're trying, and we're really interested to see how that goes and very excited for that day coming up next week, I believe. Innovative, new way of doing things, and we're hoping that that goes well and continue to learn lessons from it. You also have been provided with our internal audit reports, which I know we will touch upon. They are an important and critical tool for me in helping to seek out where we have areas in which we could improve as a department. And I would, as I think I said in my correspondence, encourage very much a focus on the follow-up reports. I mean, to me, it's always a good thing to find where you could do better. The exam question really is, how did you respond to that, and what did you do to meet those challenges that were set out? So we're very happy to pick up and discuss those, and I know you have a session which I think will be excellent with Tracy McAdams coming up next February, the head of internal audit, and we'll hopefully be able to speak, and we've shared with you our own audit plan. Happy to take any questions about any of those topics, anything else, and as I say, I'm joined by colleagues here who will have more of the detail on some of those matters that you wish to discuss.
Okay, thank you very much, and I appreciate your brevity in that regard. I'm going to start by, first of all, saying obviously the Minister of Education's trip to Israel and the occupied territories has prompted, it's fair to say, very significant commentary around adherence to the next Code of Ethics, the Ministerial Code, and the Functioning of Government Act. So, to that end, the first question I want to ask is, who is responsible for ensuring adherence to the Northern Ireland Civil Service Code of Ethics?
So the Code of Ethics, which we as a department have the responsibility for crafting and writing, and I'll bring Aisling in on a moment, sets out that standard of conduct policy that flows from beneath that, and we're in charge of setting out those policies at which each department must adhere to. Adherence to that is governed within the individual department, and there are processes and procedures in place within our various policy streams to speak to how each department has its responsibilities under that. DOF's responsibility is to ensure that that policy framework is correct to be applied by departments. But Aisling, you'll have a bit more detail on that.
Yeah, that's correct. So as Neil mentioned, each department has its own arrangements for handling concerns. That's either concerns raised by members of staff or public, and that's can include breaches or alleged potential breaches of code of ethics. Each department within their own operational procedures will have a designated officer for concerns, who's responsible for ensuring the effective handling of any concerns as they come in, and that will include the allocation of the process and to the appropriate business area. And that there's an overarching central policy called a Raising Concern Policy Framework, which sets out the central civil service position, and then under which that each department has their own operational framework.
Okay, so each department is responsible for effectively enforcing the next code of ethics and dealing with concerns as they are raised. You are responsible for overseeing the overall policy framework. Have any concerns been raised with you, your team, your department about the events surrounding the Minister's trip to Israel and the occupied territories, either within the civil service or out with?
Now, I don't know that I can answer if any particular correspondence to the Minister, but certainly to us, any correspondence of that nature would be guided to the department to deal with. So there has been no, if you like, generic question about the code of ethics per se, and any questions to the specifics of that trip would be sent to the individual department.
Okay, so just to drill down on that, if a civil servant in the Department of Education or a civil servant in another part of the civil service, or indeed a member of the public, had a concern that the trip of Mr. Given, and specifically the communications that was issued by the department, because that's the nub of this, violated civil service impartiality or the code of ethics, if they contacted you or your team, you would simply refer them back to the Department of Education?
To the designated officer who has that, if you like, the kind of gatekeeping of how that would then be handled within the department's procedures.
That designated officer, what do they then do?
Well, fortunately, I have Duff's designated officer right beside me, so I can defer that to David to speak about.
So, to answer your point specifically about this, nothing has come through the Raising Concerns team, in my team, or to me as designated officer about this case. If it were, as Neil's described, anything which we do occasionally get issues which are raised in the Department of Finance which aren't for the Department of Finance, it's then passed to the relevant department. Each department will have...
It's slightly moot whether it's been raised with you or not, because you would simply pass it back to education.
Yes, so but we'd know that it had come in. Even if we pass it on, we make sure that we've noted it so that we have sight. And each department will have its own arrangements for who looks at it and how it's handled and all of those things. And there are some sort of high-level principles which will be followed, but each department will have its own arrangements.
When it comes to their own arrangements, is it true to say that ultimately it would be the permanent secretary who is responsible for those arrangements and whatever view is taken? Of the propriety or otherwise of actions taken?
I think that's the kind. The arrangements in each department is the kind of thing that would be agreed by a departmental board to be in place for the department as part of their sort of management structure.
And certainly in the case, speaking of finance, the answer would be yes to that. For finance, which is the department I can speak to, I would ultimately be responsible for the standards and the upholding of those within the department.
Okay, I've got a couple of questions about, and then I will bring in members in a minute. Theoretically, were the Minister for Finance to visit Jerusalem and say he was going to somewhere in East Jerusalem where they were doing civil service recruitment, which is an area of responsibility covered by your department, but perhaps he wouldn't have found out, or perhaps he hadn't indicated in advance that he was going to do this trip, were he to inform the department that this is me in the hypothetical case of the Minister of Finance, I'm going to a civil service recruitment office in East Jerusalem. It's been arranged at the last minute, but I'd like to issue a departmental press release about it. How would you respond?
I don't think it's fair to try and hypothesise what a hypothetical would be. All I could say to that is as we've alluded to, I would take the code of ethics by which I'm bound, assess what I'd been asked to do, provide the advice and act accordingly. But I don't think, and I wouldn't like to get drawn into trying to speak to what decisions other departments have had to make. But if that came to me, I would make the assessment of that, provide the relevant advice and act accordingly in line with the policy.
Would you take account of the fact that going to an area which is a subject of high political controversy and is occupied, and we have subsequently found out is in a place where no UK minister would visit and hasn't visited for at least 60 years because it's certainly in a kind of general non-diplomatic way, would that be part of your considerations when you were considering what you would advise a minister?
Every relevant fact, everything that was relevant to the decision, and hopefully you're in possession of all of those when you make your assessment. But yeah, any relevant facts, whatever they might be, would be taken into consideration.
So whenever the Education Permanent Secretary was asked last week the things that he bore in mind when deciding whether to fulfil the request from the Minister to issue communications on his visit, the first thing he said was that the first thing he said that was of the things that he bore in mind before, I think he mentioned the next code of ethics, I think I'm quoting him correctly, was that the minister had made a request. And then he said that it is a high threshold for refusing a request. What is your advice, the central advice, given this department runs the central team, in terms of advising on how the code of ethics is applied? And that's why I asked you a hypothetical example, because you and this department are responsible for setting that. Ultimately, the head of civil services too. She isn't here, she's chosen not to come. So I'm asking you, in this situation, do you advise civil servants, permanent secretaries or other senior civil servants that the first and most important thing to bear in mind is that a minister has made a request?
Again, I want to be careful about speaking about a colleague and friend, but what I would say is that the code of ethics is your gold standard of what you must refer to, and certainly that would be, I'm not sure if I'd been asked the same question whether I would necessarily choreograph everything perfectly as to what I did first, but certainly code of ethics remains the gold standard. And I think it is important to say you can take it is a high bar because you're ultimately here to serve and deliver the policy priorities of your minister, but we do all that we can as a department to remind people of the importance, from webinars to updated material, about the importance and the centrality of the code of ethics. So that would be absolutely paramount in my thinking.
The idea that you can't hypothesise is surely anathema to how you operationalise a civil service code. There's no way of explaining it in the abstract. It has to be done through hypothesising. There's no other way to do it, is my view. But I do need to bring other members in. So I want to ask one final question. Your department is the lead department for the functioning of Government Miscellaneous Provisions Act, which was passed in 2021. Section 7 is absolutely clear. A minister or special advisor who holds a meeting with a third party about official business must take such steps as are reasonable to ensure that the meeting is attended by at least one person serving in the Northern Ireland Civil Service who is not a special advisor. I think lots of people, reasonable people, think that as soon as the department issued a communications about the minister's trip to this school, the OFEC school, it became ipso facto an official meeting. Therefore, the Functioning of Government Act, in the minds of many reasonable people, in fact most people I've spoken to, they think that act has been breached. Are you confident that that act has not been breached? Do you stand over the view of the Education Permanent Secretary?
Again, you're asking me to sort of run through a set of detail that I wouldn't routinely do. If it was my department, I would answer to that. So I can't speak on the decisions that I'd have made. What I would point to, though, is the importance and the independence of your designated officer, the frameworks that exist, the processes against which you assess that. You've already referred to other people who make their judgments about that, but I am not going to opine on whether a colleague and the decision that they took breaches or does not. So I wouldn't comment.
I'm going to bring others now. I will just say this in briefly. First of all, I do appreciate you've come here and fronted up on this. The head of the civil service is not, number one. Number two, I think lots of people will see that there's a strange situation where the team that is centrally responsible, ultimately responsible to the head of civil service for the operationalisation and protection of civil service impartiality in the code, doesn't have any apparent route in or enforcement mechanism or oversight mechanism of how it is operationalised in individual departments. That is purely for the Permanent Secretary, who, in this case, when asked about what he deemed to be most important when analysing the appropriateness of this communication, his first go-to, as it were, was that the Minister had asked. That's fair enough. All civil servants have to work to ministers. You then have a situation where the first and most important thing appears to be that the Minister asked, and the Minister themselves can only be held accountable by the Assembly, but there's a limit, as we found out Monday week ago, how far that accountability can go, and I think it speaks frankly to a crisis of accountability. I wish the head of the civil service was here to answer to, but she isn't, but we'll bring in others. Deputy Chair.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you all for coming here. Thank you for your letter that was received last week in advance of this, which I thought was quite clear. The Permanent Secretary of DE has accounted for events and his actions to the Education Committee last week, and it's my understanding from the letter that you sent to this committee, but just to ask you if you put it on the record, are you clear that in Department of Finance as Permanent Secretary you have no role in investigating this here?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. And I thank you all also for not being drawn on the hypothetical situations to try to frame pantomime villains out of other civil servants or elected representatives, which I feel is just part of a political witch hunt here that this committee would be better not spending so much time on. But I also had an item of interest I wanted to raise whenever you were here. It was on the internal audit reports. And I thank you for sharing those with us and being open and frank about how in addressing the limited opinions you're trying to improve internal controls, and I fully appreciate that. But one of them I just want to ask, and it's sort of whenever we'll have the HR function up here, it's around the inefficiency compensation payments. I'm a little bit unclear as to the nature of those, what they mean, because I hadn't really heard of them before. They seem quite discretionary, and they've obviously been raised here, so I just wanted to ask a little bit of understanding of the detail around those.
Thanks, and I'll hand over to Catherine on that, but it gives me the opportunity to say, I may have cut it out of my interim remarks, but I'll get to say it now. The real importance that audit plays, and we very much welcome your interest in the reports. Delighted to say we've just recently got a new satisfactory update follow-up report to that, and you'll be getting that shortly, to that particular one that Catherine will speak to. But it's also important as an accounting officer that you point your audit team to where you see the greatest risks and where you think there are areas that you can improve. And to that end, we very much welcome the committee's interest, and indeed we do pay attention to what you have to say, what you scrutinise and what you ask, and where there are areas, I take those into consideration as I plan out the future audit schedules. So when you're with Tracy and indeed Lacey, our internal, it's an odd Tracy and Lacey, but if they're both with you, you'll get a sense to think about where perhaps you as a committee might feel there are areas that we're not perhaps probing on. This is one that we've just recently got a follow-up report, and it is because of the slight interesting sort of nomenclature of how it's referred to as inefficiency payments, is something that we've had quite a focus on because we weren't sure the processes and the procedures were quite as tight as they could be. And actually one of the things which I must say to Catherine's credit, increasingly my leadership team are coming to me and saying I'm trying to reform a service. Can we bring audit in to have a look at it to help us see where we can learn? So, Catherine, I'll let you speak a little bit more about the detail of that particular one.
Yeah, so the inefficiency compensation payment is part of the civil service compensation scheme. So I think, and for me, when I came into role, and it was something that was new to me also, but I wanted to be assured that in terms of the application of that and how that was applied, that we were putting robust governance around it. So we looked at how that process would be applied under the scheme, and really what it is that if someone is dismissed as a result of inefficiency because of sickness absence, there is a potential for them to apply for a compensation payment. The compensation payment is paid on a percentage basis, and it is determined by NICS-HR. So we will look at a range of evidence in terms of whether an occupational health report, looking at the individual's absence and the absence periods, looking at were there any reasonable attempts for the individual to come back to work in the circumstances of their absence, their engagement with HR, their engagement with management, and sometimes, individuals with the best will in the world, and depending on the nature of their illness or absence, they're just not able to get back to work, and that is a process then if they are dismissed on the basis of absence over a protracted period of time. they then can apply for that, and then we have then adopted a process within NextHR where the ER manager, who would be responsible for the management and case management of that individual case, would make that assessment in terms of a percentage of the compensation payment. That would also then be discussed with their peers. So we have a group of grade 7 ER decision makers, employee relations decision makers. They would also assess in terms of, look, is that a fair level of compensation? Have we applied our processes correctly? And then that would ultimately come to me. So that was the process we put in place in terms of the application of that aspect of the civil service compensation scheme. And we asked internal audit to come in and have a look. Like, we've developed this new process so that we can provide assurance to Niall as PermSec that there are adequate governance arrangements around that. And that was, I suppose, our first cut at it. And as we did say, the audit rating was limited with a number of recommendations, but I'd say from October we've now got a satisfactory assurance on that. So it's really just that we have effective governance around the application of that scheme.
And one last remark is, Catherine alluded to, was about there are circumstances when people can't make it back to work. And one of our driving goals under the Minister is to have a compassionate and understanding service. And when you think of the roles from prison officers to, road gritters to forestry workers, a long career in that can take its toll. We have an average workforce age that's toward the latter age, much older than most private sector comparators. And therefore there are situations, with the best will in the world and all our OC health interventions and support, there isn't a route back for that individual to work.
Just for sick then? Whenever I read it, I thought it was just periods of unexplained absence, but it's specifically for sick.
Sickness absence,
Okay.
management is sickness absence.
Thank
and I suppose, and by applying the process.
We need to bring others in. Apologies, Catherine,
Yes,
just because
okay,
we've got very limited time, and if that's okay, Deputy Chair, we will have time to talk about this obviously in our inquiry. Steve Aiken.
Sorry, thank you very much indeed, and thanks very much indeed, Chair. First of all, Neil, thank you very much indeed for coming and speaking to the committee, and I'll echo the remarks of the Deputy Chair, and I think this has been an undue politicisation of a system that should be dealt with effectively by the Perm Secretary of the Department of Education, which I think it has. No, I just wanted to particularly look at the internal audit issue and the number of reds that have come up, particularly around what we could call IT issues. Have you any growing concerns about the delivery of the various IT systems we've been briefed on? And I'm particularly referring to the fact that what's just recently happened with Project Nova. Over to you, Neil.
Thank you. And it would be fair to say you typically have more audits in the IT space because they're more operational systems that we run. So they're frequently things you can, because typically audit focuses on transactions you do, be that money that you pay out or services that you run. So IT has an almost disproportionate volume of audits. I think it would be fair to say I do have a concern because of the nature of the world in which we operate today. We have an increasing and accelerating level of cyber threat. We have a disparate set of systems. We're going through GovAssure, which you'll mention, and I think is one worth chatting to Paul and the team.
Steve, you need to mute yourself, please.
Sorry, if that's what it's like hearing me for you. I don't like the sound. Is that how I really sound? But our DSF colleagues and Paul Duffy and the team there, we're really having to up our game in terms of looking at the comparator of different systems. Have they been upgraded? Are they compliant with the new technology? Lots and lots of new potential. And we're trying where we can to go more out of the box, more harmonised systems. But it would be a very fair assessment to say, if you ask me what's my number one worry, sitting as the DOF Perm Secretary, is around matters of IT and cyber. I think nearly all CEOs are worrying about that now too, but it is a different landscape to even 5 years ago, just about the level of vulnerability in systems. So hence why we have a real focus of audit going in and seeing what we can do. And as I'd encourage the committee, next time you have Paul up, have a chat through the GovAssure process, and that'll give you a good journey of how we're trying to feel a bit safer about what safeguards we can put in place.
Okay. We are very tight for time, Steve. Okay. So I'm going to ring Brian Kingston.
Okay, well, thank you, Neil, Catherine, Aisling, David, for your attendance. But I would reiterate the views that I do think you've been brought in unnecessarily, just to repeat what you had set out in the letter that we received last week, that the department, yes, sets the code of ethics and provides that guidance, but doesn't police the system. That's up to each individual department. And so you've been brought in today just to repeat what you'd put in writing in the letter. That's regrettable in terms of your time and our time. And I do think that's done for political purposes, and you'll hear different reasons offered by different members of the committee as their motivation. if I can go on to a question while you're here in terms of pressing financial matters, and not covered in your paper, so you can tell me if I'm going beyond what you can cover at the moment, but the two most pressing matters for the executive as a whole are the shortfalls in budget, 100 million in health. I'm not sure, is the EA under education, is it 280 million or 300 million? I've heard different figures. Obviously there is going to be a monitoring round, there's a budget next week, there might be some further finances coming in. What is your assessment, if I can ask you, of the financial situation facing the executive as a whole this financial year?
Incredibly challenging, and I have huge sympathy for all elected members in trying to balance the pressures that are on the budget. My minister's been clear of the argument that the level of public sector funding is inadequate. Whether we have an adequate share of that's a different question. And it speaks to the little bit about, which we might touch on, about our new AO pilot. Doing what we've always done isn't going to work. The level at which the economy is growing is not fast enough to keep up with the cost of public sector pressures. We will have to think about how we deliver services differently. Try things, try again, and we'll need our committee's support for that, because we're going to have to push the boundaries of innovating, all within as good governance as we can. But really, I am acutely worried about, collectively, the Department of Finance has an unusual role in being both its own department. I have to manage my budget and think about the wider issues. But certainly it grips every Friday PSS meeting, and I know the Minister, and sitting at length with him yesterday, worrying about how to square what looks like an unsquareable circle right now. The cake isn't big enough for what the pressures are, and I think that's going to bring some very challenging. With our transformation, don't have time to talk about that now, but there's lots of initiatives going on as we start to say all ideas are welcome, but the gap between tax receipts and cost of delivering services is unfortunately it's not just a Northern Ireland problem, but it's one that certainly does keep me awake at night.
Okay, thank you.
Right, okay. Now, I should just say very briefly, members, civil service code is the responsibility of this committee. I chair this committee and I have been reasonable about giving members their speak and will continue to do so, but it is in no way an inappropriate use of this committee's time to talk about the Civil Service Code of Ethics. So that is absolutely clear and on the record. And if it were any other minister, we would be doing exactly the same thing. Jerry Carroll.
Thank you, Neil and team, for coming in. A couple of quick questions. So if I understood you correctly, there's a person in each department responsible for ensuring the code of ethics are adhered to, and that's news to me. So I doubt that that's widely known in the public. Not to throw anybody under the bus, I think that's quite a pathetic attempt to try and to squelch any question from occurring. But did you, Neil, have a conversation with the Education Permanent Secretary before or after this visit?
No, I did not, Jerry. Okay,
thanks. The other question I want to ask is the Education Minister. I don't know if you saw the answer to Matthew's assembly question, but the Education Minister has tried to say that he didn't partake in a relevant meeting, using the terminology from the legislation several years ago. I mean, I found it incredulous that somebody arranged and agreed to fly several hundred miles across the world and didn't have a pre-arranged meeting and just kind of stumbled upon a meeting. I mean, in your experience and kind of looking at these things, I mean, do you find that in a general sense credible, whether it's comment on the specifics of the Education Minister?
Again, wouldn't comment on the specifics. One of the downsides or upsides, depending on how you look at it, in the Department of Finance, which has been my sole Perm Secretary role, is that there is not a lot of trips or visits for ministers. So I don't have a lot of experience of having to walk through the process of what a visit away looks like. But again, wouldn't speak on the comments, and I just saw that response just about half an hour before it came in today. So.
Okay, and then just a quick other question. The Minister held a meeting on November 3rd with officials to review engagements against the provisions of the Act and weather guidance. I don't think you were at that meeting. Neither, no? November 3rd?
No, not aware. Not that I'm aware of, no.
Okay, and then just a quick one. I mean, I think some people would question the fact that, like, would a permanent secretary turn round to a minister and say, Minister, you're maybe in breach of the Code of Ethics? They've obviously got a quite a close working relationship. So how likely of a scenario do you think it would be where a permanent secretary would pull a minister to say and say, you need to be careful here about code of ethics?
Again, not speaking on the specifics, but yes, that would happen. It would be a requirement, and it would be something I would be expected to do and have done.
You have done. Okay.
You have done. And just final is, would that happen on a regular basis with other permanent secretaries? Because you obviously would meet them quite regularly, Neil.
No, and I mean, I don't know is the answer, because it's not something we would discuss frequently. But one of your responsibilities is to speak honestly and provide impartial and objective advice to your minister. And certainly, I can only speak to the experience of the ministers I've worked for. Have always been entirely respectful of that advice and take it under advisement. So that's part of our job to do, is to uphold and speak truth and provide that evidence. So no, it would certainly be my responsibility and all my colleagues to say what needed said when it needed said. But what I couldn't comment on is how often that happens. I don't know. It's not something we tend to talk about.
Right, we're very tight, so we're going to have to bring in others. Because we'll have
Thanks.
to finish in a sec. Harvey.
Thank you, Chair. So, okay, thank you very much. So, on your code of ethics, that's something that's crafted by the Department of Finance. You're not responsible in any way for overseeing it, just for setting it up, not be what you say?
Yes, that's correct. And, we have fora, designated officers fora, etc. And occasionally the policies get updated or refreshed somewhat or tightened up. We've had some minor tweaks in recent times, but so it's not a document that just sits there and lives forever. We do take any feedback and it does get updated. But yes, you're correct, we don't do the policing of it for the individual departments, we just set the policies.
And that information would have been known by the committee chair before today?
Yes.
Yeah.
Are you asking him how to see into my mind as to what I did or didn't know?
And if I could continue on, designated officer, you said that each department has its own arrangements. Would that vary from department?
I'll bring in David as ours, but yes, and the reason for that, when we actually looked at the Raising Concerns framework, departments are so wildly different. So those that deal a lot with the public, direct public faith and services, would have a lot more queries and questions. So they might need a special apparatus, a committee to, if you like, triage what comes in. We would have very few because we don't deal directly with the public, so that wouldn't have made sense. So we determined that it wasn't appropriate to write one policy that was held in exactly the same way. It would have created unnecessary effort. So we have a framework under which you then craft, and we've actually had audit in to check whether everybody's Raising Concerns policy is in line with that framework. But I think it's important to say it's just the diversity of departments where you might have hundreds of calls coming in from the public to one, that you would need a different machinery in that department than, for example, you would in DOF.
So the handling of concerns is really a management issue that's managed at departmental level. And the departments, as Neil says, have quite different profiles of the kind of concerns they get. So the arrangements in each department are different.
Okay. Appreciate your answers.
Okay, one very brief one, the bring in Deirdre Hargey, who's our, I think, final questioner. You're happily, coincidentally, your predecessor in the role you hold now was formerly the Director General of Propriety and Ethics at the Cabinet Office. Now Baroness Gray, she headed up a team whose job was, and I'm quoting from the UK Civil Service, the Cabinet Office website, the Propriety and Ethics team provides guidance and support to ministers and civil servants on ethical standards. Its responsibilities include advising on complex cases, providing support in high-profile ethical issues, and assisting ministers in SAME. Does no one in the Northern Ireland Civil Service do that?
Doesn't. That's the only answer I have to that. I don't know.
The same structures don't exist here as exist in the UK government.
Obviously, I'm aware of that, but the equivalent, of course, the same structures don't exist. But is there an equivalent person or an equivalent team? It's not in DOF. Is it within the head of the Civil Services Office?
No, because departments are separate.
So there is no one who is centrally advising. I think that's why this meeting was important today. We established the fact there is no central resource to advise ministers or permanent secretaries on propriety, as your predecessor in the role you hold now did in her previous job. Deirdre Hargey.
Yeah, no, thanks very much. It's just, again, I would like a bit more clarity on the designated officer, and I suppose the firewall between I suppose the minister, and that if the designated officer does have concerns, to make sure that those concerns aren't just being pushed to the side. So how does that relationship work? to ensure that their integrity in terms of the oversight role of the Code of Ethics is being utilised. So what way does that work? And you'd said earlier that each department may add additional codes of ethics and stuff. Does that still get approved centrally then by yourselves? So I'd just like a bit more clarity on that.
Just picking up the second point, so there'd only be one code of ethics, but each department might operationalise it different, so they might need a committee or they might need a group because they have so many to deal with. So it would be more in the operationalising, but the policy is set central. There's only one code of ethics policy. David can speak to that independence, because of course there could be questions coming in about me, for example, that David would then have to handle, and there has to be appropriate checks, and I too have a line manager.
Yep. So the way in which concerns are identified and handled is what we've got to remember is that concerns actually cover quite a very, very wide range of different issues. So what we're talking about here are concerns that someone may have breached the Code of Ethics, but actually there are numerous other kinds of concerns that can be raised by members of the public or members of staff that something's gone wrong in some way. And so each department will do it slightly differently, but certainly in the Department of Finance, anything that comes in that looks as though it is raising a concern that something's gone wrong will come to the Raising Concerns team. It then there is an assessment of whether it can be dealt with in the business area that it refers to, or whether it needs to be dealt with in a parallel business area, or whether it actually needs to be looked at separately. And so if it involves, in particular if it involves the most senior colleagues, then we need to handle it carefully to ensure that there's no conflict of interest. But that clarity on conflict of interest is necessary in all cases, so that the person raising concerns knows that it's going to be handled with integrity.
Part of the code talks about complying with the law and upholding the administration for justice. Does that include international law?
I'm not aware that it's a question that's being raised specifically in relation to the Civil Service Code of Ethics, but I don't know if colleagues are aware of any other area.
I don't know. I don't know is the honest answer. Being untruthful, I don't know.
You think it should, maybe? You did, or you?
No, I think that's a point we would need clarity. And I
I'll
think
take
if
that
people
away.
are raising concerns, then, I mean, they might not know that there's a particular designated officer in terms of looking at the Code of Ethics of Ministers, but if a complaint is raised within the department or a department, does that still go to the Code of Ethics designated officer to have a look at it to see if there is any breach of the Code of Ethics?
Yes, and actually there's quite a bit of work done to make sure awareness is high, and you can find, if you Google for it, you will find, other browsers are available, you can find the name of the designated officer, but it's also important within your leadership group and your team that you constantly re-communicate. If you have any, this is where it's, and David would do a lot of triage just to look at something that maybe isn't appropriate under that vehicle, but better to be safe than sorry. So it's very important that there's a clarity for our staff and for the public, that they feel that there's a place that they can, and we are doing quite a lot to make sure that that's well communicated, well understood, and that people know who those individuals are and can get to them when they need them.
And just my last then, so obviously pertaining to the issue at hand, and I do think it's appropriate that we get clarity on these things. I don't think it hurts anyone to understand the roles and responsibilities of ministers and indeed of the civil service more holistically. But in terms of a minister goes in a personal capacity on a paid visit by a government, that where its leaders are up for in the International Court for War Crimes, and where the International Court of Justice has also made rulings as late as last summer in terms of breaches in international law, and then the department moves to issue a post on their social media in breach potentially of that law. Do you not feel that there's a code of ethics, conflict of interest issue that arises from that?
Again, I don't want to speak on other departments' behalfs. I can only speak to the issues that DOF has to deal with, and that hasn't come up in my department.
And if the department, say that they don't believe, then what's the other route then if the public are concerned about this?
Well, there are different routes about in terms of, as we've talked about, there are concerns if you believe the civil service and those would be handled through raising concerns and ultimately up through the chain that David's spoken to. And there's obviously procedures for ministerial matters, which obviously I don't speak to.
Okay, and if I can get clarity on the international
Yes,
law,
we would like clarity on
would
that.
be good. Thank
Thanks.
you.
Thank you.
So we're going to bring this to conclusion now. Folks, thank you, officials, for your time. Just say a couple of things for the record. I think it was extremely important that we had this session. It was said by the Education Permanent Secretary in his judgment, and what we've heard today is that it is primarily the judgment of the Education Permanent Secretary. And I'm not impugning him as an individual, because I think he has a relationship to maintain with the minister. That's understandable. But if he is the judge and jury on the Civil Service Code in his department, that's something we need to investigate and unpack further in this committee, for the broader consequences, including confidence in our system and the civil service more generally. The answer that was circulated to members that I received underlined the position that it was not, in the view of the department or the minister, his meeting at the OFEC school was not, quote unquote, a relevant meeting because it did not conduct official business. And that was discussed further today, that that position, that under the functioning government it wasn't a relevant meeting. I happen to have seen a separate answer which was given to Mr. Carroll, our committee colleague, who which explained the other attendees at that unofficial meeting with the Minister of Education. And at that unofficial meeting were the principal of the school, but also Nina Seltzman, Senior Deputy Director General and Head of the Pedagogical Administration at Israel's Ministry of Education, the Director of the Division of International Relations at the Ministry of Education. Quite the unofficial meeting guest list. I think one of the things that has come out of this hearing is that we have a bit of a Wild West in terms of the Civil Service Code, I'm afraid. I think this team has fronted up and come and given us a broad outline. I genuinely appreciate that today. But what we have heard today is that it is primarily for individual departments to set their own. The rules are set by the Department of Finance, but it is no rule basically in enforcement, unlike in other jurisdictions, including at UK level. It is ultimately for the Permanent Secretary to decide what constitutes a breach of the code and interpret the Civil Service Code and indeed the law by themselves. And when asked about it, that individual Permanent Secretary said at the Education Committee last week that he was mindful, first and foremost, of the fact that the Minister had made a request, and that declining ministerial requests involves a high bar. I think that is concerning in itself, particularly when there appears to be no additional cover at the centre or from the head of the civil service in terms of protecting the Civil Service Code and the impartiality of civil servants. And I think this is something we need to investigate further. I think it's very, very concerning, and I also think it's disappointing the head of the civil service wasn't here today to explain her position, what she has discovered in her factual investigation, and provide some reassurance to the public. It's doubly problematic in accountability terms when, as we know, there are very clear limits to the ability of the Assembly to enforce the ministerial code via its accountability mechanisms. The public is very concerned about accountability in these institutions, and I worry that the civil service has been dragged into that, not by me. Okay, members, we're going to release but one final point, not on this subject, but another propriety issue relates to yesterday's oral ministerial statement. As I've discovered, there was a press briefing yesterday morning before 9:45, before we were issued with the oral statement at 10:26. As you will be aware, Standing Order 18A is very clear about about standing orders and about when statements should be shared with the Assembly. So can I ask that the department goes away and looks at whether that standing order was breached? I've already raised it with the Speaker's office.
Yeah, I'll take that away. I don't have the answer to that too.
Okay,
but
thank you. I'm aware that journalists were briefed at 10:45. None of us received it until at 9:45 on the rating statement. None of us received it until 10:26. So this one definitely is for the Department of Finance in terms of propriety, so we'd like an answer. Thank you. Cheers, guys.
you.
Appreciate you coming.
Thank you, members.
Okay, members. So, members, I'm going to go to 6 first before we start our evidence session with the Irish Fiscal Council, Fiscal Advisory Council. Agenda item 6, draft minutes of the meeting we held on the 12th of November. That's at page 90. If members are content that they are a true reflection, I'll sign them. Are we content?
Thank you.
Content. Thank you. Now, agenda item 5. I presume members are content that Hansard provide a transcript of this. It's at page 13 of the meeting pack, and there's a clerk's memo. We also have the Department of Finance response to the OECD call for evidence and the OECD review of the Irish Fiscal Council, which is at page 21. So, say members, this is the 5th briefing on the bill, and the first of 2 today. We have 2 members of the Fiscal Advisory Council joining us. Seamus Coffey, first of all, who is chairperson of the Fiscal Advisory Council, and Niall Conroy, who's chief economist. We are really grateful for your time today, gents, and I know you're up against it. We had an additional briefing, so I appreciate you're both very busy, and I appreciate your patience waiting a few minutes for us to start. Seamus, if you're able to give us an opening statement, and I don't know if you want to contribute to it now, but we'd love to hear from you. And then members indicate if you want to ask a question.
Well, thanks very much. Well, and thanks for the invitation to speak here today. We welcome the engagement. And we hope the perspective of the Irish Fiscal Advisory Council will be helpful in your deliberations. I suppose initially, by way of background, the Irish Fiscal Advisory Council was established in 2011, initially on an administrative basis. The Council was then formally established on a statutory basis in December 2012 under the Fiscal Responsibility Act of that year. Independent fiscal institutions can provide an independent assessment of the public finances by raising awareness of these issues. A more informed debate can be had. Many advanced economies are grappling with the cost of ageing populations, climate change, and other spending pressures. Independent fiscal institutions are well placed to highlight some of these longer-term issues and the trade-offs policymakers may face. These issues are not often the focus of the annual year-to-year budget process. Reflecting on the legislation that had set up the Irish Fiscal Advisory Council, I might briefly highlight what has worked well and maybe what on reflection could have been improved. We'll start with the positives. First, the Council has a clearly defined mandate set out in legislation. This gives a clear sense of purpose and a focus for the Council's activities. Secondly, the Council's budget was set out in legislation. This set the initial ceiling for the Council's spending. It also clearly set out how the Council's budget was to evolve over time. The Council's budget is set as a standalone item rather than part of the overall estimates for the Department of Finance. And finally, legislation sets out that the Council members are to be selected based on their competence and experience in domestic or international macroeconomic or fiscal matters. Consideration is also given to gender balance of the composition of the Council. On the other hand, then I might finally outline three shortcomings in the legislation underpinning the Irish Fiscal Advisory Council. Firstly, that Council's budget, mentioned above, is legislated to move in line with inflation. However, a significant share of the Council's cost is salaries, which are linked to public pay levels. Public sector pay has increased at a faster rate than headline inflation in Ireland. As a result, the Council's funding has not increased in line with costs. There is now a proposal to amend this so that the Council's budget evolves in line with costs. This is supposed to be measured by a combination of public sector pay rates and general inflation. Second, the Council's statutory right to information is actually quite limited. In many instances, the Council relies on goodwill for information from government departments. While this often works satisfactorily, it is not best practice. The proposal for Northern Ireland compares very favourably. And thirdly, the Council is somewhat constrained in how it utilises its budget. The Council still has to secure approval for hiring additional staff and or regrading of positions from the relevant line minister. So that just briefly sets out a couple of positives and maybe some shortcomings in the case with the Irish Fiscal Advising Council. I'd like to thank the committee for their time and look forward to answering any questions you have.
Well, that was really admirably broad but brief, which is the optimal opening statement. Seamus, thank you. You mentioned that the two things about the budget stood out to me there about the Council's budget in the South. One, it's not part of the department's main estimate, so there's it's a freestanding item. If you could explain a bit more about that. And number two, the fact that there's did you say the legislation provides that the budget increases with I don't know if it's a particular measure of inflation, if it's CPI or whatever, but that has been a problem because it doesn't keep up with salary costs. So if you could just say a bit more about both of those, the freestanding nature of the budget allocation and what measure of inflation is used to operate your budget.
Yeah, thanks very much. I'll take up on those, and maybe Niall would like to come in as well. But on the freestanding nature of it, so the budget for the Irish Fiscal Council was set out in legislation. So once the legislation was passed, in a sense, that spending now was locked in. So it doesn't have to go through the annual estimates process. It would be what we'd call non-voted spending on an annual basis because the legislation is there that requires that spending to happen. It's not subject to the sort of I suppose the roundabouts that can happen with the annual budgetary process. The budget is set aside, it's in legislation, and has to be paid over to the Fiscal Council every year, and is not included in the annual estimates process where various line items might move up or down depending on the overall envelope of spending available for a particular department. So in a sense, it moves the fiscal council away from the annual process and puts it on a concrete statutory basis. So it's not in the estimates process. It is what we call non-voted spending. Now, the vote was with the legislation, but once that passed, then the spending happens every year. Now, the legislation also set out how that budget was to evolve. So an initial ceiling was set for 2012. And then the budget was to evolve in line with inflation. Now, the measure of inflation that was chosen initially was the HICP. That is a sort of an EU standard measure of inflation. It's close to the CPI. There are fairly modest differences between them. But the HICP, the Harmonised Index of Consumer Prices, it is an EU approach to measuring inflation. It's pretty close to the General Consumer Price Index. But in the case of Ireland, and maybe similar to other countries, once that was introduced, we actually went through a period of around 10 years of close to zero consumer price inflation. So the budget, in overall terms, barely moved from that original ceiling. And while initially there was maybe a large gap between the annual spending of the council and the annual budget ceiling, over time that gap got narrower and narrower because the cost of the council, the largest cost is staff wages, and salaries were increasing in line with public sector pay deals, and they were ahead of inflation. So even if the staff numbers weren't increasing, you had this gradual erosion of that gap between the actual spending and the ceiling. It got quite close, and the ceiling had to be adjusted by an amount to make sure that the actual spending that was happening was in line with the ceiling, and there wouldn't a problem arise, because again, without increasing staff numbers, the level of pay began to rise. Now there is a proposal to change that, so the legislation for Irish Fiscal Council is due to change, and it is due to kind of take a combined approach. Price inflation will still play a role, but the ceiling will be linked to a public sector pay, so better aligned with the costs than we've seen in the case up to now. So we haven't necessarily met huge problems when it comes to that ceiling. We get close to it, but the ceiling was increased, and that in itself is a pretty significant change because it does require a vote in Parliament. But now we hope that with the amendment of the legislation, a ceiling will be set, and and then the annual change will be based on inflation and public sector pay. Again, just to highlight a final point about the ceiling, is that we don't necessarily, in the Fiscal Council, have full flexibility about how to use it. The legislation does require the Fiscal Council to still seek approval from the relevant line minister if additional staff are to be hired. If we're within budget and want to hire additional staff, approval for that position has to be got from a relevant line minister. And if we want to move a staff member to a higher salary scale, approval also has to be sought for that. So we do have a ceiling, at least it's set aside. It's not going through the annual estimates process, but there still are some restrictions on how that budget ceiling is used.
Okay, that's really helpful. And in relation to the access to information, which is another aspect that you've mentioned, where you think our legislation, we've heard actually that we could beef that provision up even more, but you think our draft law is more appropriate or more robust than south of the border?
Yeah, so I'll let my colleague Niall come in that, who'd be more involved in the day-to-day engagement between us and various departments when it comes to accessing information.
Yeah, so I suppose the area where we would probably have most engagement with the Department of Finance directly will be around endorsing their macroeconomic forecasts. So twice a year we would be charged with assessing and endorsing the macroeconomic projections produced by the department. And access for information on that side of our activity is perfectly fine. It's set out under a memorandum of understanding between ourselves and the Department of Finance, where in other aspects of our mandate, though, we are kind of relying on goodwill. So for things like access to information around, assumptions that might have been made as part of the budgetary process or information from various we don't have a formal right to access information from those bodies. So in those cases, we are kind of appealing to goodwill rather than having a formal or statutory right to get that information. So from the draft I've seen of the Northern Ireland Fiscal Council bill, it looks much stronger in that regard than what we would be working off here.
Okay, that's really helpful. You'll obviously be aware you're a fiscal advisory council and a very successful one. You're a fiscal advisory council for as it were, sovereign government, which has, issues its own debt and levies all of its own taxation. This is a devolved government, but which is one of the reasons why that is given for us not having an economic forecasting power on the face of the bill. But that's one of the issues we're looking at. Do you think that the power, your functions in terms of forecasting, or at least looking or marking the department's forecasts, I think is that a better way of describing it? Is that complementary to the other fiscal work you do? Do you think it would be hard to do your core fiscal work without having some form of economic forecasting responsibilities too?
On that, I'm happy to jump in, Seamus, if you want to add to it. So I think, part of your assessment of the budgetary forecast or what the fiscal stance should be would definitely be informed by your view of where the macroeconomy is going, and your understanding of how it's evolved to that point. Definitely, from our point of view, that is definitely helped by the discipline of us endorsing a set of forecasts twice every year. We do, as part of that process, we would produce our own set of forecasts internally before we look at what the Ministry of Finance have produced, so that we kind of have an independent view before we start looking at their forecasts, something to benchmark their forecasts against, which we think has been quite useful. So from our point of view, we would find it useful for the other parts of our work that we are doing that work around the macroeconomy and the forecasting piece. But even if that wasn't part of your mandate, you could engage and do some of that work on your own bat in order to be better informed for your view of fiscal policy in general. But certainly for us, it's definitely a good discipline in terms of it's something that we have to do twice a year. So it is something we are very mindful of. But I wouldn't say it's you could certainly have a good, well-informed view of the macroeconomy without having an endorsement function as such. But for us, it certainly is complementary to the other work that we do.
You do the do you produce your own economic forecasts, or is it?
We do. We produce our own set of forecasts. Yeah. So we would do that, and we would complete that before we get sight of the forecast that the ministry have produced. So we would have our own set of forecasts separately. Yes.
I suppose my question is: do you have any particular views, notwithstanding the fact that this is we're a devolved region rather than a separate sovereign state, and so you're basically looking at what happens to the block grant, which comes from London. Do you think there would be an argument for doing having an economic forecast as well, or for the fiscal council having the ability to produce its own economic forecasts to feed into its fiscal analysis?
Look, for most fiscal councils, I'd say this more generally, for most fiscal councils, I would say the best practice is that you are producing your own set of macroeconomic forecasts. Now, that is contingent on you having enough resources to do that, as well as the parts of your mandate that you've been assigned. Like some fiscal, we'd be quite well networked with other fiscal councils around Europe, and some of them would have the endorsement function that we have, but wouldn't go and produce their own set of forecasts. They would rely on other independent forecasts that are being produced by a central bank or by private sector forecasters. So it isn't absolutely essential to produce your own set of forecasts, but I would say typically that would probably be best practice if you have the resources to do it.
Just on that, I'd add that we don't necessarily see ourselves as sort of a forecasting organisation. Yeah. So Niall says we do produce forecasts, but we actually only publish them after the fact. So when it comes to the budget, the government's forecasts are used as endorsed by the Fiscal Council, and then subsequently, a number of months later, our own forecasts would be published, but we wouldn't necessarily make a significant deal of them. I do think undertaking the forecast, in a sense, underpins the fiscal work you're doing, because you have to be able to sort of appreciate and understand the economic environment in which the fiscal policies have an effect. And as Niall says, not all fiscal institutions, independent fiscal institutions, would do their own forecasts, but certainly would use them, whether produced themselves or by others, to have an understanding of the economic environment in which the fiscal policy changes are being enacted. So I think it is useful. We wouldn't see it as central to our role. The endorsement is clearly central. And to help us do that endorsement, we create our own benchmark forecast before we get those from the Department of Finance. We produce them independently without seeing what the department are going to do. And then if there's significant differences, we can try to understand how those differences have arisen, and maybe we've done something better, or perhaps they've done something better, and reconcile that then through the endorsement process. We've done it as twice a year over the last 12, 13 years. There has been some minor differences from time to time, but in each time we've done it, the fiscal forecasts have been endorsed.
Okay. We'll bring in others now. Deputy Chair first.
Yeah, thank you, Chair, and thank you both for joining us today. Being behind others isn't where you want to be, but it gives us a good opportunity to learn from others. So I'm just keen to hear any feedback you would have under the current legislation that governs yourself. Is there anything that you feel constrains your work, or you're not happy with, or you'd want to draw our attention to, so we can look out for it as a potential pitfall of our own?
I guess going through what we said previously, like one of the constraints we face is that although a budget is set, obviously you'd always perhaps like to have that budget to be a bit larger to be able to do other activities. But one restraint we feel that is a bit of a restriction on us is that although the budget is set, we're also restricted on how we can use it. So we might have, say, a gap up to our ceiling that we might think we could hire additional staff member using that gap. But we have to get approval from the line minister for that position to be introduced. So we don't have full autonomy when it comes to the use of the budget. And it's set out in legislation that if the Fiscal Council is to hire a staff member, or if the Fiscal Council is to move a staff member to a higher pay grade, approval must be got from the relevant minister. And that is a bit of a restriction.
Yeah, and thank you. And we had a bit of discussion around that ourselves in previous evidence sessions on this, because our Fiscal Council will be set up in a governance structure that is linked as a NDPB set up of the Department of Finance, and then ultimately it's our Department of Finance that's approving the budget. So, just that very clear conflict of interest on the face of the legislation there. So it's really, really useful to take away, because we want to make sure that we're maximising the potential of the Fiscal Council whenever we're bringing it forward there. Thank you very much. No, thanks, Chair.
Okay. Jerry Carroll.
Thanks, Seamus and Niall. Thanks for your time. So just in terms of, you mentioned sort of the forecasting and the macroeconomic stuff you do, would you just give a view on government budgets?
Niall, yeah.
Yeah, so in terms of the actual budget that would be passed by the government, yeah, absolutely, that would be a really core part of our work. So we would be assessing both the budgetary forecasts themselves. So do we think they look credible? Do they look reasonable? Are they likely to match what the outturns will be? But also we would give a assessment of what we would call the fiscal stance. So is the budgetary policy being pursued helping to kind of smooth the economic cycle, taking money out of the economy when it's very strong, putting money in when the economy is quite weak. So that would be a pretty central part of our mandate at the moment, and it would be something that probably people would see as the most front-facing part of our mandate, as opposed to the kind of endorsement of the economic forecast that wouldn't be quite as public to most people.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, just on that, we do a lot of kind of publications during the year, but maybe our three key publications that get significant attention, as Niall has referenced out, would be linked to the budget process. So we'd have two main reports, one sort of in June in response to the government setting out the broad parameters of the budget. Well, at least they're supposed to set out the broad parameters of the budget in the spring. Then we'd have a pre-budget statement, so maybe 3 or 4 weeks prior to the budget, we'd go into more detail about what it is that the best approach for the government to take would be. And then we have a publication towards the end of November, or one for this year will be coming out next week, where we actually assess what the government did in the budget. And they would be sort of the three sort of pieces of work that the council does that would create the most, get the most media attention, most political attention. And they would also then be linked to appearances before the Oireachtas of the Parliament on the basis of what's included in those reports. So assessing the budget is essentially the key plank of the mandate that we have.
Okay, and would you be minded, or have you in the past sort of criticised the budget for doing a certain policy, or maybe the government kind of backtracking on a pre-election policy, or would you just tend not to criticise budget? How would you just normally operate that?
So in the main, we look at the overall impact of the budget. So the overall level of spending, the overall changes to tax revenue. Our approach wouldn't go into individual measures. So the government might make promises on the basis of particular tax changes, or offering particular services or supports, or perhaps changes to social welfare. By and large, we'd stay away from those type of debates, which would be much more on the political side. They're important, they're key, but it wouldn't necessarily be part of the functions for the Fiscal Council. We'd be more looking at the impact of the public finances on the economy as a whole. Is the government running a counter-cyclical policy? Is the government spending money into an economy that's performing poorly? Is the government preparing for the risks that might be coming down the track, both near-term risks in terms of economic growth, etc., and then long-term risks like demographics, climate change, etc., impact on productivity. And again, wouldn't be going into particular measures to try and look at those. But so in broad terms, we'd look at the overall budget. And yes, we would be critical at times of what the government has done if we felt that spending growth was maybe beyond the capacity of the economy to sustain it, if risks were building up, if the government was pumping excess demand into the economy was performing well. So in Ireland at the moment, we have an unemployment rate of around 4.5%. So the economy doesn't need fiscal stimulus. They'd be the sort of assessments we'd be making rather than looking at individual changes in income tax or particular payment rates.
Yeah, thank you. And just kind of on that sort of, it may be called fiscal stimulus, but other terms could be used. There's obviously a huge surplus in the south, and there's been obviously a demand for that to be used rather than just, I think the government has used rainy day fund in different terms. Not just me and my party, but quite a lot of people would say it should be spent to kind of tackle the housing crisis and insert any other crisis after that. Would the likes of that, would you give it a view on that and advise the government to do X or to do Y, or would you just not take a view on that?
Yeah, so when it comes to the Fiscal Council, again, it wouldn't necessarily be what to use the money for. It'd be more whether the money is used at all. Again, the choices would be political. So if we take our current advice, what we'd be saying about what the government has done in the most recent budget there at the start of October is that they're planning to run down those surpluses. So for 2025, the government is expecting a surplus to come in of around 10 billion. That is a huge sum and pretty significant. For 2026, the budget as set out is for that surplus to reduce to 5 billion. So the government are intending on spending a lot of the surpluses that have been built up on the back of perhaps uncertain revenues, particularly with corporation tax in Ireland, which has soared in recent years and is going to exceed 30 billion in 2026. But these uncertain corporation tax revenues of 30 billion are translating into surplus of 5 billion. So the approach of the Fiscal Council would not necessarily to look at where that money is being spent and the particular items it's being spent on, if it's housing or health or social protection, more the vulnerabilities that potentially builds up. But if this uncertain source of tax revenue was to reduce, which is a possibility, what happens to that spending that you've built up? Do we just spend the money when we have it? If this corporation tax is coming in, are housing, health, and social protection so important? Now, we should be doing them all the time, not just when you have these type of revenues available. That should be put on a sustainable footing. So we would be, in a sense, critical of maybe some of the risks that are being allowed to build up on the back of these huge tax revenues, which are a positive to be collecting them. But do you want such vital spending like health, housing, social protection, and to be based on them? That is the choice to be made. And it does appear, at least for 2026, that the government is choosing to spend most of that revenue.
Thank you. Just final questions quickly. You talked about the vulnerabilities, and that was my final question. Obviously, the southern economy is quite connected and vulnerable to tariffs, corporations. Obviously, there's the language of Trump of America first and all that to kind of withdraw, and threats of pharmaceutical companies and others being withdrawn from the south. I think that's a bit of critique of that in my party for years about the economy being reliant on that methodology or that framework. It's been very, very vulnerable. Would you have a view on advising the southern government and the economy to kind of move away from that over reliance on US corporations, even for a self-interest perspective?
You're absolutely right, and it is a key issue, and it's something we do devote considerable resources to examining the impact of the investment, the concentration, international policy changes, US policy changes, and that would impact both our macro forecasts, like what do we think is going to happen to investment and exports and employment, will be clearly linked, and also to the fiscal forecasts because of the huge surge in corporation taxes come through. And yes, you would be right. We would say that it would be a concern and a risk. You have huge concentration, like of that 30-odd billion of corporation tax, which the government collects every year, over 60%, around 60% of that comes from just 10 companies. The concentration is extraordinary. And this would be a risk that we would frequently highlight for the government in terms of trying to broaden the tax base. Again, not making particular recommendations about how to do that, but you do it on the income tax side, the consumption tax side. They're really political choices. But if you have such a narrow tax base, it is vulnerable, it can wobble. And down here, we have seen that back in 2008 when the tax base became very concentrated in construction and property-related taxes. And they disappeared pretty quickly. Now, we don't know what's going to happen with these corporation tax receipts. We don't know what's going to happen with the investment, but there are clear risks, and you're right to highlight them. And it's something we do devote significant resources to. We mentioned our main publications that are linked to the budgetary cycle. We also put out a number of papers a year on economic and fiscal matters and the role of foreign investment, the contribution of US companies, and the concentration of corporation tax are a regular feature in those publications that we put out.
Thank you.
Okay, Jerry. Brian Kingston.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Seamus, Niall, for your time. I'm interested in the level of powers that you have. I notice you've the term advisory in your title. You've a role there, though, of scrutiny. And over the operation of the Council, to what extent has it found itself in disagreement with government financial forecasts, and what is your role if you have a different view on financial forecasts compared to the government? I think it's always in the interest of government to talk up the economy and financial forecasts, and you would be trying to give a realistic assessment. So is your role almost to engage in the debate in the public square, and how much is it your role to challenge publicly if you are in dispute with what government's opinion is?
Yeah, so a very good question. I think we'd see ourselves as having three audiences. One is the government itself, and clearly the ministers involved in the setting of the budgets. Two is the broader political sphere, both members of the government parties, members of opposition parties, and engaging with them. And then third, you have the general audience, general public, and we would seek to engage with all of those. We'd engage directly with the minister's officials through the endorsement process. We'd engage with the politicians through appearances at committees such as this, and we'd engage with the general public through media publications, media appearances, television and radio, and we'd see them all as being very important. In terms of sort of a formal, what can we do if we disagree? Well, one, you can try to move the debate in your direction through all of those channels. But the legislation does set out sort of more formal mechanisms that we can trigger. Now, we've never triggered this, but the mechanism has a principle called comply or explain. So that if we were to disagree with a government position on the financial side, on the fiscal side, and say that this is completely inappropriate, either the numbers are wrong or the direction that fiscal policy is taking is completely wrong, we can trigger comply or explain, which gives the government a period of time, I think it's maybe 3 months, where they comply, they actually take on board the advice the council is giving and amend or adjust their forecasts or budgetary plans, or they go before Parliament, the minister has to go before Parliament and make a presentation to Parliament about why the approach taken by the government is correct and fine, and why it's in opposition to the view of the Fiscal Council. Now, that comply or explain has never been formally triggered, but it does happen informally. Like, so when we issue a report or issue an assessment of the government's budgetary position, ministers will get questioned by the media if there are differences between our assessment and their assessment, and that sort of comply or explain does happen implicitly, but within the legislation there is a formal comply or explain if we felt things were going very off track and had to be triggered. But since 2012 that hasn't been the case, but that provision is there. But we would see our audience of working with the government in terms of our assessment, working with the politicians, telling them what they see, and then going on the media as sort of an informal approach to achieving that same outcome.
Okay, no, that's interesting. What was the second word there? Comply or explain?
Explain. Employer
Explain.
explain.
Okay, no, thank you for that. One other question I want to ask, Chair. Obviously, the Republic of Ireland is part of the Eurozone, and you've referenced there to the need to comply with the Euro Fiscal Treaty. How much does that factor into your work, and has it happened that the Eurozone, whatever way that's managed centrally, have challenged the Irish government's budget or financial forecasts, and have you found yourselves somehow in the middle of disputes in that respect?
To some extent, yes. Now, one thing about the broader EU rules and the Eurozone rules is that they're set for all countries, and they must take into consideration. So the fact that they apply generally across a group of countries. So like we've frequently made two comments about the Euro fiscal rules, the fact that they're not appropriate for Ireland. And there are benchmarks or thresholds set within that EU framework, but it's on the basis of GDP. And we've already spoken about the high concentration of foreign companies in the Irish economy, and that also, and the high amount of corporation tax that they're paying, but it also leads to a high level of profits of these companies in Ireland. And that isn't money or income that's available for us to spend. That is the money and income generated by foreign companies. That goes back to their shareholders, mainly in the US. Now, we do get the 12.5% tax on the top, but Irish GDP is a huge number that doesn't necessarily reflect our ability to spend or our ability to service debt. Now, at EU level, there are thresholds that your annual deficit can't be bigger than 3% of GDP, and your overall level of government debt shouldn't exceed 60% of GDP. Now, from an Irish context, those benchmarks are inappropriate, and they should be better framed in terms of Irish national income, which is about 60% of GDP. So one issue with the EU framework is that Ireland rarely, at least in the last decade, rarely gets close to those thresholds. There was obviously the sovereign debt crisis in 2008, when we significantly exceeded them, but we're in a different world now, where Irish GDP has ballooned in recent years. So we actually would find ourselves somewhat in opposition to some of the more benign assessments made at European level, which follow the rules to the letter. They're based on GDP, wouldn't take into account the surge in corporation tax in Ireland, and would generally see Ireland as being in a hugely positive position, running surpluses, having a debt ratio that's well below that 60% threshold, where we, on the other hand, domestically would be saying, look, these EU rules aren't appropriate for Ireland. We should be following our own interpretation, our own framework based on the national income that we have, which is much lower, and taking into account the risks we face, such as corporation tax. At EU level, they just view that as being a source of tax revenue. Don't take into account the concentration. And so you can get some conflict there, where you have a relatively benign assessment, legal assessment coming at EU level, and maybe a much more analytical and maybe a much more critical approach happening at domestic level. And it can be hard to get your message across, particularly when the government saying, look, we're complying with the fiscal rules. What is our fiscal council doing, criticising us when we're living up to our legal obligations? We go a bit beyond the legal obligations and look at the economic consequences.
Okay, that's very interesting. Just those Eurozone restrictions inhibit your total financial sovereignty, and your role in that. That's very interesting. Thank you.
Okay, so no further members have indicated that they wish to ask questions. I'm just going to ask a couple of final ones to clarify points. One of the other, it goes back to something we discussed earlier on, and it's been a perennial question for us to get to the bottom of, is we talked about the budget setting process. Your budget is, though it is not part of the overall estimates for the department, it is, as it were, set by the department. It's legally it's set by the department. It's not so. It's not. You're not a. You don't get your budget set by the Oireachtas or a committee of the Oireachtas. It is the Department of Finance.
No, it's set by the Oireachtas. It's in legislation. So although we're outside the line items, we are under the remit of the Department of Finance. But the Fiscal Responsibility Act sets out the budget for the Fiscal Council. And once that's passed, once that's voted on by the Oireachtas, it can't be changed. So obviously the Department of Finance gets to set the legislation that goes before the Oireachtas. But it can't be changed on a year-to-year basis. The only adjustment at present is made for inflation that sees it rise in line with inflation. So you would be looking at the budget being separate, being independent to the political process set out in the legislation. So I wouldn't say it's set by the Department of Finance. It is initially when it comes to the legislation, but then on an annual basis, it can't be changed unless they go back to the Oireachtas, back to Parliament, and get a vote of Parliament to change it. And that is something that is probably unlikely to happen. So it does ring fence and set out the budget and gives that independence.
In a kind of formal legal sense, it's the department, but because it's separate and they are constrained in law from, for example, if you had a minister who really didn't want a fiscal advisory council to exist, or was really hostile to its working, or it was in conflict, they couldn't automatically just say, right, give them tuppence halfpenny next year, we'll see how they like it. That cannot happen. Okay.
They would have to go into Parliament, have to put legislation, amendment through Parliament for that to change. They would have to explain to Parliament why it is they're doing that and why Parliament is to vote for it. It can't be just done with the stroke of a pen.
Theoretically, that can happen.
Very important, because obviously there's a bit of a conflict between our funding department, the Department of Finance, which is also the department we assess.
Yes.
And if our funding was linked to the Department of Finance, well, you could undermine the credibility, undermine the independence of the Fiscal Council if the Department of Finance could say, look, unless you toe the line here, we're not going to release our budget. That can't happen. Our budget is set out in legislation, and regardless of what we say, regardless of our assessment, we're guaranteed that. Now, we would like the annual adjustment to change, but more a minor point. The actual budget itself is set in legislation, and that's crucially important.
Okay, that's helpful, because that's one of the questions I think a number of us have. Part 2, clause under the staff section, I guess, clause 13 of part 2 of our bill. I'm not expecting you guys to have it in front of you, or to be too, but one of the questions that's been raised is about the staffing. So I'll just read out to you the provisions of this part of the bill. It says the council is to employ a person to act as the council's chief of staff. The council may employ other staff. Then it says the chief of staff and other council staff are to be employed on such terms as the council, comma, with the approval of the department, determines. So staffing is effectively at the approval of the department. Number one, is that the case in your council? Number two, do you deem it to be advisable for other councils?
Yeah, I'll let our head of secretariat, our chief of staff, deal with that one there. I can see him smiling there. Niall, this is for you.
Go ahead, Niall.
So that sounds familiar. So that sounds reasonably similar to the setup that we would have on a legislative basis. So we would have to get approval for any new member of staff that we're hiring, or if we wish to regrade a member of staff, say to a higher grade, we would need prior approval from the ministry to do that. In our view, and I think the OECD would be of a similar view, that they feel that fiscal council should have full autonomy over how to use their budget. So if they have a budget of €1 million, they should be able to decide which way to best allocate that, whether that's through staffing or whether that's through software or other services that they might procure elsewhere. So our view would be it would be better for the council to have full autonomy over how it uses its budget. Then actually, the question does arise of, well, there have to be some safeguards, right? And I suppose one thing that you do in exchange for your independence is you have to have accountability. So we would be accountable both to the Oireachtas, but also we would have periodic peer reviews. So we would have an independent peer review of ourselves every 5 years or so. And I thought that was something that you guys have mentioned in the legislation that you have there in draft. That seems reasonable. I suppose the other thing I'd say on that as well is, you could say, oh, well, you don't want to give the fiscal council too much autonomy over how it spends its budget, but trust me, there's no body that's more careful with how it spends its own money and is more sensitive about misspending money than a fiscal council that is advising a government on how to do so. So it is something we are very mindful of.
And like when it came to the establishment of the fiscal council, there clearly was views that there was risks here. So we have the budget set, we have the budget ceiling indexed in line with inflation, as Niall has gone through there. You have restrictions then on how that budget can actually be used. And also the Irish legislation sets out that our Comptroller and Auditor General will audit the Fiscal Council every year. We are a tiny part, a blip on the overall scale of the national budget. But every year we're subject to an audit from the Comptroller and Auditor General, who submits a report to Parliament, to the Oireachtas, on the accounts of the Fiscal Council, not on our assessments, not on our work when it comes to the government's budget, when it comes to our own budget. How do we spend the 800,000 euro we have? So there really is a sort of a view out there that there was a high risk. But as Niall says, like, if any entity, agency is going to be careful with its budget, it is a fiscal council, because if you want to profess and make assessments of the government's overall budget, well, if you get your own house in order, you don't want to be getting questions about your own budget when you're trying to offer advice on the overall budget. So I think that natural reputational risk serves as a sort of a key safeguard. But the level of safeguards that are in place in Ireland are very, very significant. The budget is set, only adjusted by inflation. Any additional appointments or promotions are subject to approval by the minister, and there's an annual audit from the CNAG. And that essentially is belt and braces that perhaps goes a bit too far.
All right, so remind me again, what's belt and braces that goes a bit too far is the...
Having all those safeguards in place, like having a fixed budget, like we can't spend more than that budget. That's what we're allowed to draw down from the central fund. And then even within that fixed budget, not having the autonomy to use it as we see fit. We might have excess, a gap to the ceiling that we could fit in a staff member. Unless we get approval from the minister, we can't do that. And then our annual accounts are subject to a full audit every year from the Comptroller and Auditor General. So even though the budget is quite small, the level of safeguards that are in place seem to go beyond that which we would deem necessary. Like one of those would be sufficient. Like a budget ceiling should be sufficient, because you can't go beyond that. If you didn't have a budget ceiling, then you might say, oh, you have to get positions approved, and the ceiling would change depending on how many people you're working for. And then you could see, well, if you don't have a ceiling, there should be restrictions on the number of staff you can hire, because you could just keep hiring. That would seem, but having both seems unnecessary. And then on top of that, to have the annual audit seems like a third leg that's not necessary again.
Okay, Seamus. Now I don't want to intrude on private grief, but clearly there's a bit of bitter experience which is being shared with us for our benefit, and that's kind of, if not better, then certainly.
I wouldn't necessarily say bitter. In the main, our framework works pretty well. It's just when it comes to resources, we've no issue with a budget ceiling. I think that's sort of the appropriate way to go. But within that, then there should be some flexibility for the council. Those that at the coalface know what the work that's required, know the resources required to use that ceiling. Certainly not going beyond it. The ceiling should be hard, but within that ceiling, there should be some flexibility.
I think that's really important for us when we're talking about part two. I'm going to bring in Brian Kingston, who wants to get back in.
Thank you, Chair. Just a brief question on how much of your time is spent on the expenditure side of budgets and how much on income. I'm just mindful that in our case, we don't have the same tax raising powers, so our income, obviously we have rates income, but it's largely through the block grant. So whilst we depend on the national economy, we don't have the same levers in adjusting income from taxation locally. But how much would you find your own fiscal council focuses on? Do you think there's enough work to be done on the expenditure side, even with that reduced tax raising power? Or do you find you spend a lot of your time on those financial forecasts on the income side?
Now you go there.
Yeah, so I would say we probably spend pretty similar amounts of time on revenue and spending. So, some of the parts of revenue that Seamus mentioned earlier around corporation tax and some of the vulnerabilities there, we would spend quite a bit of time investigating that and the, even the specific companies involved and where we think that's heading. So the revenue side is definitely important. The spending side, can be probably more. It's probably more resource intensive to investigate. There's probably more going on. It's probably harder to understand at a headline level without delving into the specific departments, what the month-to-month spending is looking like, what the kind of pressures from an aging population or from inflation are having on spending levels. So it can be quite resource intensive to fully understand what's going on behind the spending that you're seeing. But I would say overall, we probably spend a reasonably equal amount for our analysis on both, because both of them are equally important for us in terms of assessing the overall fiscal stance or the budgetary forecast that the Department of Finance is producing.
Okay.
So yeah, I would say we're pretty equal in both.
Okay. Okay, thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, Brian, that was really helpful. If nobody else wishes to come in, thank you, Nancy. One final question. One of the it may be that it's there might be some merit in looking at potential MOUs or collaboration with the Northern Fiscal Council. Has that happened? Have you considered that yet in its current guise, or has the department asked about it?
For us to have a relationship with the
Northern Ireland Fiscal Council, and some for example, there's obviously Shared Island. The dispersal of Shared Island monies is one example where there is a degree of. So, for example, we know that the primary relationship will be a definite relationship with the OBR, and one would hope the Treasury at London level, and presumably with the other UK devolved, which I think would be very useful. But in terms of cross-border stuff, could you see a world in which that is useful? Specific, I know that the work is largely jurisdictional, but specifically thinking about shared island dispersal of monies and things like that.
Yeah, if the sums were to be significant and it was to be something that would have an impact on either economy, you could see merit in that. Like, there is some interactions, most of it informal at this stage. Like, so the fiscal institutions across the British Isles would tend to meet maybe once a year. And would also meet at international meetings. So, as Niall mentioned, there's an OECD gathering, and sometimes on the sideline of that, you can have meetings between Scottish, Welsh, the OBR, and the Northern Ireland, and the Irish Independent Fiscal Institution. So there is some interaction between, but nothing on a formal level. And if that type of funding was to increase, well, then you could see value in putting that on a more formal basis. But until it was, I think most of the work would remain jurisdictional. Is it going to change economic performance? Is it going to change the overall budgetary outcomes? Until that were to happen, I think leaving them on an informal basis is best. So some of it does happen. You would have interactions, as I say, at maybe a regular meeting, and then meeting at more international meetings. But moving to a stage where you might need something like an MOU between the fiscal institutions, north and south, no, I don't think that would be necessary at the moment.
Okay. That's helpful. Nobody else has indicated they wish to come in, so we're going to say thank you to Niall and Seamus. We may be again in contact with you to seek clarification on anything that came up today and other points. But can I just say thank you very much, gentlemen, for making your very precious time available to us. That has been really helpful in terms of our consideration of this bill. And thank you for your patience. We were a few minutes late because of other urgent business we were attending to, but we really appreciate your time, and that's been really helpful. Cheers. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. We really appreciate the invitation. We're happy to help. And if there's anything further you need, don't hesitate to get back to us. We're always willing to cooperate. So thanks very much.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Thanks both.
Thanks, guys. Take care.
Thank you, Garma. Okay. Members, agenda item 7 is matters arising. We're sort of doing things in a relatively unusual order today. The first matter arising is 7.1, 7.2 relate to the deaths, stillbirths and baby loss certificate bill, which obviously passed its further consideration stage yesterday. It's really for noting only. This is just the grouping. It's in our pack just for the grouping of amendments, but it is now academic because it's the further consideration stage is passed and final stage will be coming up. I suppose it's worth just saying for the record that was a very, I thought it was a very useful, constructive debate, and I know members in this committee worked with the Minister to get clarification on points. I think that was really useful. So I would acknowledge that.
Final stage, Chair, 2nd of December. So.
2nd of December, final stage. Okay, I think that's really a positive moment for us as a committee and all those interested in the bill.
We would seek to do some publicity around that as well, because it's
great.
The bill getting on its final footing.
Okay, terrific. So as to note, there is now we're going to go through some Dallo readout responses starting at page 110. The first of which is Presbyterian Mutual Society. That's at page 112. Members had asked for further information in relation to FCA registration and compliance with financial services legislation. The Department has indicated that under current regs, it is highly unlikely that a body accepting public investments or deposits would be able to operate without FCA authorisation unless a clearly defined exemption applies. Some organisations do not need, may not need FCA authorisation. However, such exemptions are highly specific. The Department of Treasury has indicated they are not aware of any audits or continuing liabilities for any similar organisations in Northern Ireland. So that response is to note, unless anybody wishes to say anything more about it. 7.8 is from the Communities Committee. and it is a cross-departmental briefing on retrofitting and future-proofing homes. They're holding cross-departmental briefings, which will include officials from the Department of Finance as well as DERA and communities. So they're making us aware of that as a courtesy. So if members are content, we will ask them to copy the Hansard to us once it is done. So the next agenda item is 7.6, which is the BITES project initiative Tech Secure. Series of words which I need to sort of properly process to see how each one connects to the last. But anyway, that's at page 116. The committee previously forwarded correspondence to the Communities Committee from the BITES project. This was forwarded by this committee given the subject area is more pertinent to the community's remit. The project is seeking to strengthen digital capacity in the community and voluntary sector. Members, if we're agreed, it might just be useful, given some of the stuff touches on an area that at some point, I would venture before Christmas, we will organise an informal, non-compulsory meeting for members. If they're content with that, yeah. Deputy Chair.
Yeah, thank you. Will we do that in partnership with the Communities Committee, just in the interest of doing more joined up work?
We'll see if we can find a suitable time. It's always easy when the two committees are on the same day and opposite ends of the day, but we'll see what we can do on that one.
Chair,
yes, go ahead.
Just for that, I'm not clear what this is about. It talks about, well, in the letter to the Committee for Communities in relation to the attached correspondence, but I don't think we've received the attached correspondence. Was it in the previous?
Yeah, it was in the previous pack. Sorry, we should have put that one in again. I thought we had we? No.
Okay, well, sure. We'll get it if it comes up.
We will circulate that.
Okay. 7.7, but I mean, it's an interesting thing which kind of touches on some of what we do. It's not completely like top of our priority list, but it's something of interest. 7.7 is from the Communities Committee. Again, it relates to building regs. It's to page 118 of our pack, members. So the Communities Committee has written to the Department of Finance asking for a time frame for the new building regs and how they will take stock of future proofing. So members, we've been copied into this correspondence and we get a response as part of that, one would assume and hope. So 7.8 is from the Secretary of State. So members, this is at page 121. The committee previously wrote to the Secretary of State in relation to the local growth fund with the view that the allocation should be made in partnership with the Executive and reflective of the PFG and relevant departmental priorities. The Secretary of State has indicated that a productive meeting between the Finance Minister and the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government, Secretary of State, took place to discuss the fund took place on 22nd of October, and that cross-sector engagement is ongoing to co-design the fund. Further updates will be provided and information on the development of the fund and engagement plans will be set out in due course. Now, I think a useful action from us on this, I had a meeting with Go Succeed yesterday, which is the organisation that works across councils to support entrepreneurship and are very interested in this subject and worried about the future, and we'll discuss that next week. But they and obviously loads of other organisations are interested in this. I think it would be helpful if we get from the Minister and the Department a readout of what they discussed on the 22nd of October. People are content with that? Deputy Chair, wish to come in?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. And just to declare, I chair the all-party group on the voluntary community sector, and we had a very useful session yesterday where it was the launch of the NICFA report, the commissioned report by Pivotal on basically the outworkings of this fund and links to economic inactivity here, and some of the actions coming out of our all-party group where that we're going to write to ministers, going to write to committees, including this one, just to ask to draw attention and lobbying around this, especially on the 70-30 plan split of this fund between capital and revenue, which is very much a cliff edge that's making this potentially catastrophic for the sector. So I don't know if obviously that letter will be coming through that way, but just as you say, I would support your proposal for a readout from what happened at that meeting, but I think that it would be really good if we could maybe have some sort of a briefing or something just to kind of expedite this. We're in the middle of November now. You know, we're we're looking straight into this. As I say, that report was launched yesterday. It was a NICFA report commissioned by Pivotal. You know, with correspondence will come through, even a written briefing from NICFA, a copy of that report. If there's anything that we can do on this, I know the Minister has taken action on this. He does seem committed to trying to resolve something. So if there's anything in any way that this committee could do, I'd be very supportive of that.
I think that is very sensible. I think a written briefing with a view to a potential oral briefing, but maybe even before Christmas, if we could squeeze one in, is not a bad idea. Certainly immediately after Christmas, given the pressure, and I presume we're not going to hear any more about the budget. Brian wanted to comment. Brian, please.
Just further to what Diana said, I mean, I was also at APG in the voluntary community sector yesterday. So, I mean, I would propose that if you're willing to reply to the Secretary of State's letter, just welcoming that he has identified the concerns about that funding for economic inactivity projects, the beneficiary and the staff in the sector that we're all aware of. So I think it's welcome that he has specified that, you know, and I know that's going to be sent to the committee, but electronically, whether we forward on a copy of that report. Unfortunately, it's more
This is the NICFA report?
Yes, NICFA was done by Pivotal.
Yeah.
On the benefit of those voluntary community sector groups, the extra reach they have in reaching people who are deemed economically inactive, quite in particular people with health and disability issues, and helping them into employment by that close support. So if we were to forward that on as a recent report, it's more qualitative than quantitative, but we could maybe get some quantitative figures as well to back it up, just so that we're doing all we can to highlight.
Although I agree with all that we should forward all that. I'm not sure we should be. I'm not sure. I don't want to hold us up by getting the committee team to go and do loads of other open source research. But I think forwarding the committee, the NICFA report is definitely a good idea. If we're content with those actions, forwarding that report to the Secretary of State as decided, asking the department for a written, potentially no.
Chair, I'm also mindful that the Chief Secretary of the Treasury wrote back in a similar vein on the same issue. Would members like a similar letter issued to the Chief Secretary of the Treasury?
That makes sense. If people
they seem to be working in tandem.
Or people were highlighting this too.
Yeah, well, we'll do that too.
Yeah, and I think one of the concerns that was raised, certainly in relation to some of the entrepreneurship stuff, which will be similar to some of the NICFA concerns, is obviously around the capital resource split and the lack of flexibility. Now, obviously, we want capital investment is great, and we want as much capital investment as possible, but if you're heavily restricting some of the resource spending, you're therefore restricting the ability to pay wages to people who are doing really vital support for people in terms of getting people back into work or whatever it is. Okay, we'll do that. So members, I think we're agreed on that. 7.9 is the gondola, the Mourne Mountain Gondola project. That's at page 124 of the meeting pack. This is the correspondence which we considered during last week's meeting. It was received during the meeting, so we've now put it on the record. It's not new information because we discussed it last week, I think it's fair to say. The board confirmed to us that it has not agreed a specific time frame for Newry Morning Down, but we have written to the department to clarify their position and I've forgotten the name of what the technical term is, the responsible owner or whatever, the person who's she's very good, she briefs us, yes, on the Belfast City deal and all the city deals, to give us a view on it. I think just ancillary to that, we've also asked the question about the Mid and South West growth deal and why Fermanagh and Noma Council are hands off on that one. So both of those responses are pending. Members content with that? Okay. 7.10 is Chairperson's Liaison Group. That's at page 126 of the meeting pack. Chairperson's Liaison Group, which I should declare an interest. I also obviously said because I'm chair of this committee. I don't always get to attend the meetings, but I was there yesterday. The CLG has noted copy correspondence to the Minister of Finance forwarded by this committee regarding the removal of the mandatory requirement to advertise all external recruitment opportunities in the 3 daily newspapers. I'm just going to say something slightly on a personal note, which is in the past week, today, as this is Wednesday, and every Wednesday for I don't know if it's the full 189 years that the Down Recorder was published in my hometown. People would have got local news about that area of Eastern County Down, and it did everything from holding people like us to account, what happened in the local courts, what happened in the local councils, covering the 12th, covering the local GAA. All of that stuff is not now happening. Our local papers are completely critical. This is one small area where, and this related to the 3 newsletter to the Belfast Telegraph and Irish News, but I just think this is something for us all to be mindful of in terms of it has been something the department has looked at in the past, and I personally would like to think that the public sector here and the civil service is doing all they can to protect where they can. They can't subsidise endlessly titles if they aren't economically viable. But I do think we should be thinking about this as a policy, and because we're losing something really important, and just to say that as a personal thing, because I think that part of the world has lost something really, really important in terms of a community resource and also accountability for people like us. So I deeply regret that, and I just think it's something for us to think about. Okay, but I've made my speak there. Agenda item 8 is the Fiscal Council. We're going to get an oral briefing now from the Fiscal Council itself. And they are there. We're actually slightly ahead of time, despite people could have taken up more time than some of the other ones. But anyway, so members of page 128 of the meeting pack, there's your clerk's memo. We have the Fiscal Council in front of us, well, it doesn't. We have correspondence from the Fiscal Council detailing its views in the bill. The department's response to the Fiscal Council's views in the bill at page 135, of the pack. And we're going to get an oral briefing from Jonathan and obviously Sir Robert. I would anticipate members will want to ask questions, and I think we have communicated to our colleagues, the Fiscal Council, that we may also ask questions about the broader fiscal picture, both in terms of the Northern Ireland budget and also the fact that there is a fairly high-profile UK budget coming up in exactly 1 week's time. Without further ado, we'll welcome Sir Robert and Jonathan, as always, to the committee, and ask Sir Robert to make an opening statement.
Thank you very much indeed, Chair. Can I just first of all check you can hear me okay?
Yes, you're very loud and clear. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you, and apologies not to be able to be with you in person. I don't think there was a great deal I wanted to say by way of introduction beyond the fact that the bill, I think, is nicely structured, addresses many of the key issues that you would hope and expect to be addressed in setting up an institution of this sort. We're obviously helped by the input from the OECD in terms of a good practice for these sorts of institutions, and the bill is, very largely consistent with that. There are some areas where you can certainly make arguments that you could tweak in particular respects. But I think it's important, obviously, to bear in mind that we are not a typical fiscal council or independent fiscal institution in the international context in a couple of senses, one of which is that for most of the other institutions, the preparation of macroeconomic and fiscal forecasts, or alternatively the scrutiny of the governing authorities' fiscal and economic forecast is a key part of the role. That's not a part of a key issue for us, obviously, because of the way in which the executive is funded and the preponderance of the resources coming from the block grant rather than from tax receipts, for which there is a close and reliable relationship with what's going on in the macroeconomy at any given time. The second, obviously relatively unusual feature is that the legislation and the operation of the organisation needs necessarily to be prepared for a variety of actors being in charge of the budget, whether it's the executive or the Northern Ireland office or caretaker ministers and the NICS accounting officers. So there may, for example, as a result of that, be questions about whether you are scrutinising a budget or you are commenting on the absence of a budget. Those things can be important as well. So as we've discussed before, I think the need to be flexible in terms of the fact that you might be dealing with more budgets than you expect in a given time, or fewer budgets or no budgets in a particular period of time, is something that you just have to recognise. And I think we've dealt with most of those circumstances over the 4.5 years to date, and you can't rule out the possibility that though you would have those in future. So I think some of the key things that you would be looking for around transparency around the appointment process for members of the Fiscal Council, the importance of access to information are both important as well. I'm delighted to report that the relationship that we've had with the departments that we've been seeking information from, not just finance, other departments as well, everybody has been very helpful and provided information where there has been information to provide. So again, you want to avoid legislation which has the unintended consequences of making something that I think is working reasonably well work less well, and I don't think this trips over that wire in any very obvious fashion. So I'm happy to leave it at that and take any questions you might have.
Thank you very much, Sir Robert. I'm going to ask a couple of questions about the bill, and then, as I say, I might ask some questions about the broader picture. Members can do so as well. I won't be unbelievably hardline about enforcing a kind of a split between the two, but just in terms of the bill, we have heard, including from the Irish Fiscal Council, the IFAC, which was on a little while ago with us, the need to, I suppose, future-proof for political scenarios which you can't foresee. And in one way, people might say the political scenario in Northern Ireland is not necessarily the composition of the political parties in power, because that, shall we say, has been relatively unchanged for quite some time. But and obviously consociationism, power sharing, means that most of the assembly is or can be represented in an executive. The uncertainty is around whether there is an executive in the first place. Having said all that, it is true to say that you can't necessarily foresee a situation. Though you might not at the minute be able to foresee a situation in which a finance minister of any party is hostile or sceptical of the Fiscal Council, it could happen, even if at the minute it's been broadly benign. Would you say that isn't there an argument therefore for just tightening up in a couple of areas where the face of the report gives quite a lot of latitude to the department? One, for example, is on the staff, is clause 13 of part 2, which basically says terms are with the staff terming, the terms and conditions of staff are with the approval of the department. And obviously, in the absence of a surety of independence elsewhere in the legislation, other than that there will be a Fiscal Council, that's a bit should we be looking to tighten that up, or just give it a little bit, give you guys a little bit more independence?
I think there are various aspects where you can argue that you can frame these things more or less tightly. I mean, one example would be the provision of, being clearer about what information you are entitled to and when. I think the danger with that actually is that it is quite hard to foresee the circumstances, and if you don't have good working relationships and try to maintain good working relationships with the people that you're exchanging with information with, you can get into situations where if you have a very tight definition in the legislation, you can still satisfy the requirements of that legislation to the letter, and yet do so in a way that is unhelpful and not conducive to the efficient running of the process. So I think this happened, for example, in the case of the Spanish RF, a very fine example of the Fiscal Council, where I think, if my memory serves me right, they ended up in a difficult relationship with their equivalent of the Department for Work and Pensions, but they still satisfied the request to provide the information that they were asked for, but it literally turned up in a big pile of printouts. in a way that was completely difficult to use. So yes, I think at the margin, I'm sure there are ways that you can tighten up some of those sorts of requirements, but I think you also at the same time have to be realistic that if the working relationships aren't working, then however tightly or well written the legislation is, that still leaves everybody in a very difficult position, and it highlights the importance of entities like this committee to say that things need to be approached properly in the spirit as well as in the letter. But I certainly wouldn't, if there are proposals to tighten aspects of that up, I certainly wouldn't stand in the way of that or suggest that that's not a good idea. But as I say, if working relationships aren't working, then you can write all the legislation you like. Things are going to be difficult, and the public isn't going to be as well served as it could and should be.
Okay. Just on a matter which I think I've asked you about before, you're probably bored answering me about it, but it's on the subject of economic forecasting and whether the Fiscal Council should have the duty or the obligation to either produce an economic forecast or reflect a composite of other robustly constructed economic forecasts. Is your view, just for the record, that that the Fiscal Council bill definitely shouldn't have that provision, or therefore the Fiscal Council shouldn't get into that area, or is it that based on your current, as it were, work programme, it isn't essential? Is it that it's inadvisable, or that it's currently not essential, but it may be something that we could reasonably insert?
I think you have to distinguish between the fact that you might think it is a useful and interesting thing to know about the evolution of the Northern Ireland economy versus the fact that this is a fiscal council focused on, how the budget is performing, how the budget's balanced, long-term sustainability issues there. And the fact is, given the very large proportion of resource that comes, and I use resource, money that flows into the budget in resource and capital, etc., the vast predominance of that coming from the block grant with historical component and adjustment by the budget, by the Barnett formula, that is not driven by the developments in the macroeconomy. The lone major source of tax revenue, regional rates, there is in a sense some link with the macroeconomy there, but rather indirect one, reflecting the way in which things are valued. So it really would not be adding anything to your ability to do the core job of commenting on and explaining on the budget process here, because there are just not a large number, or there is no large amount of money that flows into the executive's coffers that is dependent on the performance of the economy. Now, that's not to say that there might be other reasons why you might think that knowing more about the performance of the Northern Ireland economy is a good idea, but that is something that can equally well be done outside by outside entities as well as by the Fiscal Council. And having very happily spent 10 years with responsibility for a macro and fiscal forecast at the UK level, after spending 10 years as a journalist and at the IFS mocking other people's attempts at doing those things, I think taking on that role and entering into all the sorts of debates that you have about how good or bad the forecast is looking, etc., would potentially subtract rather than add to the credibility of the institution. So I think that the relatively tight focus is appropriate. It's not simply that we'd really love to do this, but we don't have the resources. I think that would change the body into a very different sort of institution and could have unintended consequences in terms of its credibility in commenting on the things that we're currently supposed to be commenting on.
That's clear, and I appreciate you being giving a view on it. I suppose one other point might be that one of the arguments made about our policy conversation, not just the fiscal conversation, is that whether or not you agree with greater fiscal devolution, more tax powers and more local revenue responsibility, lots of people would say that not enough of our policy making is geared towards economic outputs, because the incentives for local ministers are not really connected to economic outputs. And even if you don't have greater fiscal devolution, it would be a better thing if ministers, for example, in relation to skills policy, were better able or more accountable for the economic impact, good or bad, of the decision they were making. I just wonder if there's any way we could, I'm sort of asking to speculate here, so tell me to go away if you like, but if there's any way we could use this bill to engender a little bit more conversation on the economic as well as the fiscal impact of policy decisions, because I do think there's a thing which doesn't happen here, which is we don't really talk about the economic impact of the decisions we make, and therefore there's not enough of a political incentive for people to make decisions on that basis. So I wonder, is there anything we can do to encourage a little bit more of that using the Fiscal Council?
I think the balance is probably still in favour of having a relatively tight. I take your point about the that there are. So, for example, to take one concrete example, we highlighted in the report that we did on NI Water that one of the consequences of the funding arrangements at the moment, which is not the point that's unique to us to having made, is the widespread belief that that is an impediment to industrial and residential development, particularly around Belfast, but not just, that would have impact has a detrimental impact on the economic performance and the economic potential of the region. Devoting an awful lot more effort on the part of the council to try to quantify that in any sort of meaningfully robust way, I think would be quite a challenge. There are other people who are equally well able to do that sort of thing. So if there's an interest in more input of that, I think there's the possibility of commissioning that sort of work for people who are looking at the Northern Ireland economy more generally anyway. I think sort of bolting on a large sort of regional macro function onto the Fiscal Council as it stands at the moment is not necessarily the best way of scratching that itch, even if it's a legitimate itch.
Okay, well, I do think it's still an itch, so unfortunately I haven't, though I very much appreciate your answers. It hasn't completely solved that itch, but it's a conversation for another day, or others may ask it. Just on one final point before I come on to broader UK matters and how they pertain to here, Sir Robert, just on the question of where the budget is set. We've had a lot of discussion in terms of scrutinising the bill about obviously the two broad models are in terms of how the budget is set and therefore where kind of funding independence lies. The, I guess, congressional budget model where you're funded and monitored from the legislature, and whether you could do that, whether we could even do that here via something like the audit committee, and there are definite challenges that are pretty significant to doing that and arguments against it, or the model which is in the legislation as it's drafted, which is basically the department funded. But even within the latter, there are some other safeguards. So, for example, we were just talking to the Irish Commission, the Irish Council, and they have an effective safeguard, or a form of a safeguard. It's not complete, but it's that that Fiscal Council is legally funded by the department, but it's outside the estimates process, and therefore it is effectively in a legal sense funded by the department, but it is in effect separately funded. Is there any argument for something like that in the bill? And again, I'm aware you don't want to be advocating too much. Yeah, I mean, this isn't a hill on which I die. In the OBR context, we had a similar debate when the OBR was being created as to whether it should effectively be funded in the same way as an agency of the Treasury would be, or whether it should be more like the National Audit Office, where you have Parliament essentially having not the Public Accounts Committee, but the Public Accounts Commission, a separate body which is sort of responsible for setting budget and broad strategy, etc. My view there actually is that even though the OBR was essentially a watchdog over the Treasury, the way in which the OBR and the Treasury had to play nicely together for the budget process to work meant that actually the resources that the OBR needed were more likely to be safeguarded, ironically, by a clear line with the Treasury than they were to be on a line through Parliament, where the focus on how well this is working in practice wouldn't necessarily be as pronounced. But clearly there are
in Northern Ireland, sort of different sorts of models for, as you say, for those institutions that are not funded directly through the process. I think you have to recognise, obviously, we are a public body. You are, spending £600,000 or so a year of public money on it. So, you can't take it, completely out of the political purview anyway. I think in many countries, the most important thing is the transparency around the budget. So if there is a squeeze, you can identify it and see it. And, it's fairly straightforward that if the government says we're funding them as perfectly generously as we always were, but that's not the case, you're able to sort of demonstrate and appeal to the court of public opinion. That's important. Clearly, in the OBR context, also the aim was to be, you would like to have a multi-year budget, but obviously in the same way that, you need to have a multi-year executive budget for there to be a meaningful multi-year budget for the council. So certainly at the OBR level, you were looking for, relative clarity about what the OBR would get over the period of a spending review in each year of a spending review, rather than just say, oh, it'll come out of the overall Treasury pot in an amount yet to be determined. That level of granularity is quite important. Obviously, we're not necessarily going to have maybe and hopefully we will have a fully articulated multi-year budget at the executive level, in which case a similar time horizon for looking at the budget for fiscal council would be sensible. But in the absence of that, there may be formal obstacles to doing that. But it's certainly not something where I have a very strong view that it really should or shouldn't be more oriented through a process outside the mainstream executive budget, whereas I did have quite strong views on that at the OBR level. But Jonathan may have a more informed view as well, on having seen more of this from the inside.
Thank you, Robert. I was just going to add that from an operational perspective, that clarity of what the budget is, as Robert said, is just as important as what the budget is. So the kind of we don't necessarily expect special treatment, and I think any of those models can work that you're describing, as long as as long as the relationships are still there. But yeah, that clarity of what have we got next year, especially because it's such a small team. You're talking about 5 or 6 people. So actually, a small budget change can mean that we can no longer afford as much kind of resourcing, and 1 or 2 members of staff makes a very significant difference in such a small team. And just to go back to the previous question, Chair, although you probably won't thank me for it, but there's probably also an operational side to that additional function would kind of dilute that resourcing requirement. So if there were additional functions, I think this is just my pitch, and we would want those to be resourced, to be adequately resourced, so that it wasn't diluting the work of the council members and the council staff team as well. That's my plea.
Force you to construct a macroeconomic model and run it several times a year without extra money. I'm going to bring in members in a second, just before, and then we'll have a chance to come back to the multi-year budget. But since, Sir Robert, you raised the OBR, I think it's important just to ask you about your view, given as you highlighted your own long experience of that organisation. And there has been some commentary, I think it's fair to say, about the iteration of the UK government's forecast and information going back and forward between the Treasury. So the OBR has been subject to controversy and comment itself more recently. Have you been surprised, I suppose, by some of what we've seen in terms of the OBR and its iterative process in terms of getting policy measures from the Treasury, producing updated forecasts? That has been dragged very prominently into the public debate, like as it's going on, like right now. We're still a week away from the budget happening. That's really unusual and probably suboptimal.
Yeah, there are 2 aspects that to the, I mean, most recently in terms of the way in which you've seen, or rather one has read in the newspapers, about the evolution through the lead up to this particular statement. Certainly in my time, you didn't get the sort of briefing, and it's not for me to say, or indeed I don't know where that has come from, in terms of the flying of kites as regards particular elements of policy that the government is thinking of or not thinking of, or public commentary on how the OBR forecast may have moved from the first round ahead of this forthcoming budget to the second round to the third round. I think that that is not generally helpful, and I suspect in calm reflection afterwards, the government may conclude that it hasn't been particularly helpful for them on this occasion as well, that there is a good reason why you have the flow of information taking place in private while the government is making up its mind, while the OBR is refining the forecast and looking at the forecasts of those, and not having that speculation through makes life, I think, easier for everybody. It is a salutary reminder to people that if you do have, as we have in this situation, essentially 3 rounds of OBR forecast, which you then shut down, and then you have 2 rounds where it's only affected by the policy measures, that you can get movements even at that short time horizon. And I think what you have seen, obviously, or I would assume, is that the OBR at the time of each forecast has to take a view on, for example, the how expensive it is for the government to borrow, so gilt yields, on what's happening in other financial markets, and there has been a quite sharp fall in the cost of the price that the government has to pay to borrow in the last of the forecast rounds before it has been closed down. So you are in a situation in which it may be that the government's perceived room for manoeuvre or lack of room for manoeuvre has moved around, but this is a feature and not a bug, because your debt interest bill does indeed depend on day-to-day movements in financial markets. So that's that is a source of volatility and uncertainty when you're trying to put the budget package together, but it's a fact of life, not a failing of the OBR. There's a broader question looking across the fiscal events more broadly, which is you are going to get forecasts moving up and down because of new data, new judgments, new movements in financial markets, from one budget to a spring statement to a budget to a spring statement. And those forecasts move up and down, and you really don't want taxation and public spending decisions to be as variable and need to move up and down with quite the same frequency. And the problem is, if you basically have very clear fiscal rules, you have a very small amount of room for manoeuvre against them, you are vulnerable to a natural, and again, it's a feature, not a bug, movement up or down in the forecast that then appears to leave you with grounds to make up or spare resources. And again, I think that's an issue where the government or governments need to think carefully about the interaction between the fiscal rules that they set themselves and the inevitability that OBR forecasts will move up and down. So the OBR is not forcing the government to raise X amount or Y amount of taxation. The government sets itself fiscal rules. The OBR produces a forecast and assesses whether the government is on course to achieve the fiscal rules. It is rightly for elected ministers to decide if the OBR says you're not on course to meet your rules. Do you change the policy, change the rules, or just say, I'm actually going to be content for the forecast to show that these rules are being breached because I'd rather wait and see how things look in another 6 months. Those are things for which the government can take any of those options within the legal framework, and should be happy to explain those to the public, whichever choice it's taken.
It's very helpful, and we may come back to that, but I want to bring others. I should say, I don't know if it's an interest, I worked in the Treasury Press Office when Sir Robert was running the OBR and had the joy of getting his updated the OBR's updated forecast through and responding to them. Deputy Chair.
The word joy is carrying a lot of weight in that sentence,
yes.
I suspect.
Yeah, very well. You said that, Sir Robert, I wouldn't possibly. Deputy Chair.
Yeah, thank you, Chair, and thank you both for joining us and being available throughout this process for us. We've been quite fortunate to get some quite detailed and insightful evidence so far. For me, the 2 main things that are coming through where I've got some concerns are around just the discretionary element within the budget. It's been raised by a couple of different people. Obviously, where the department has closer control, it just takes away the Fiscal Council's discretionary powers and potentially the perception of independence. But I think I'm more concerned about just the appointments and the way that it's set out in the legislation, because obviously we're very fortunate, the two of you are sitting there and you're excellent, and we really, really appreciate that. But when you're reading the legislation, it reads like the department can just allocate or appoint anyone to these posts. There's no merit-based element or competition or requirements set out there, and I'm just a little bit concerned about that. I just want to know what your thoughts or feelings are on that, if you think it needs to be built into the legislation or sort of subclause guidance, what it would be. But I just feel that it's just something that gives me great concern, that we want to make sure that this is guaranteed, that it will always be of this high professional standard.
I think there are two issues there, one of which is that, and this will be the same with the OBR, there is a process for public appointments that has rules, has the need for people to be appropriately qualified, etc. So there's a question mark as to what confidence you have in those rules that apply generally to all appointments, of which these would be one category, or whether you feel that there is the need to be more specific or more prescriptive here. So I think the OECD, if I remember correctly, the guidelines are they're sort of specifying a greater degree of what skills or what capabilities are required. That I can understand that those are important things, and there may be countries where you've had essentially mates of senior ministers being appointed to these sorts of institutions, and that would fly in the face of that. I'm not sure that putting in the legislation that you need to have a particular expertise in public finance kind of really resolves that problem if people are really determined to act in that way. So being more prescriptive about the sort of people you might want to appoint, I'm not necessarily convinced that that's a terribly good idea. Another issue, of course, is the role of the Assembly and of the committee over either agreeing to having vetoes or the opportunity to comment on or to speak to people who are proposed for these bodies in advance. So, as you probably know, in the case of the OBR, the Treasury Committee in Westminster has a formal veto over appointments to the Budget Responsibility Committee, so the job I held and the two other people on that committee, and that was seen as being a useful bolstering source of reassurance on that front, whereas typically other appointments you might have people asked to come and appear before a committee and talk, but there wouldn't necessarily be a clear veto there. Again, not a hill on which I would die on either side, but I think if that were, if you felt that it was appropriate to bolster it in that way, that would be something that would be consistent with the approach taken at the OBR. I would be more wary about, here are the 8 set of characteristics that we're looking for in everybody you appoint to a body like this. If you have a committee of more than one person, then inevitably some people are going to have a greater degree of expertise and interest in some areas. It's also, we've with the way in which the council is constituted at the moment, you've got obviously Northern Ireland-based people. You have me from the rest of the UK. You have Alan from the Republic, and so again, that I think is a good and helpful mix. Whether you want to write it down in legislation that it has to be that way, I would be more cautious about. Again, I think the transparency, the knowledge that there's an appropriate process going on, and the willingness of the committee to say, well, this is the sort of balance of people, and are you really sure you've got the mix, that you're being given the right mix, is a very appropriate question to be asked. And I've been, very fortunate and content, both with my colleagues as council members and with Jonathan and his team of staff.
Thanks very much. I think that there definitely is room for something to be put in here, and the OECD were quite critical of this as it sits, and it had came up in the evidence session, and I had spoken a little bit to it that here in Northern Ireland, obviously our Department of Finance is sitting with the two strands of being a departmental. Just Department of Finance operations, but also the Treasury function, and just the fact that it's the one department does, if you don't understand the operations of it, does make it all seem even more conflicted. But definitely think something there, even looking at the OBR.
Well, it's interesting. It's arguably, you'd say, less conflicted than in the OBR case, because the Department of Finance is less powerful relative to the Treasury in London, where you might argue that it's able to pull more strings, whereas, as you rightly point out, in addition to being your finance ministry, the Department of Finance is one department in a coalition, and you don't have the same first among equals relationship with the other departments to quite the degree that you do at Westminster.
No, definitely. Definitely a whole lot to think about there, but I really appreciate hearing from you today. Thanks very much.
Okay. Ryan Kingston.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Sir Robert and Jonathan, for your time today and your written submission. I mean, reading through it, in terms of the actual wording of the bill, it's useful your comments on it, and I think it's fair to say you're content with the actual wording in the bill, or is there anything you would want to highlight where you would make a case for amendments to the wording in the bill, or are you broadly content with the actual wording?
Broadly content is the answer. I think there are perfectly legitimate judgments to be made about, as we've just been discussing, do you want a greater or lesser degree of, additional reassurance around the appointment process and role of committees, etc. But I don't think, and Jonathan may want to come in on this, that I have any particular anxieties around the wording. As I say, I think that the particular challenge for drafting in this context relative to the OBR is that the role is, a key role is to comment on, how is the budget working? Is the budget being balanced, and how? And is it sustainable? When that budget can be run by the Stormont institutions, it can be run by the NIO, it can be run by, as we've seen, caretaker minister, accounting officer combinations, and you can get situations, hopefully not as we come to the end, or rather towards the end of the calendar year. We'd like to see, we are all hoping that we will see a draft budget, ideally a multi-year draft budget. There may be a situation in which that doesn't materialise, and that is as important a point for the Fiscal Council to be saying something and providing information to you than if there was one. So framing the legislation in a way that recognises, the line I've often used is that the question I learnt after 6 weeks in this role was to stop asking, how does this normally work? Because often people said, well, actually normally work is a bit of a category mistake here. So that flexibility around different ways in which the budget process can move, the uncertainties around the calendar, it's important for that to be there. And I think that the bill, is not, there are no alarm bells ringing for me that this is sort of entirely designed for a system in which, the executive is in the driving seat and everything is being done bang on the letter with the appropriate amount of notice of consultation, etc. There is scope for the Fiscal Council to comment and to write and to send information to you and others at the points when it appears most useful to do that, not necessarily on some particular timetable that you need to do something X days before or X days after some other event, when knowing when or how that event is going to materialise is a lot easier in other countries than it is in this jurisdiction.
If it's okay, I might just jump in. Sir Robert's mentioned the budget publication and the timing and whose budget is it that we're commenting on, or are we commenting on a budget or a lack of a budget? There was one other point that we'd raised in our evidence, which was around the thematic and general sustainability reports, and we had said that there was maybe that the wording in I think it was Article 4 that we were confused is maybe not quite the right word, but that it wasn't straightforward, and thank the committee for referring that back to the department and for sharing the department's response with us. We are content with the understanding that we have now from the department, which effectively is, just to put it on the record, our understanding at the moment is that the council can choose between general and thematic reports, and on a year-to-year basis, depending on what seems the most useful or what seems the most relevant, but with a kind of hard catch-all clause that we would do two general reports every decade, which seems reasonable to us. So we're happy where that's got to, and thank the committee for clarifying that for us. I think that's ended up in a good place.
And I think another point to make is that sort of drawing the line as to what is a thematic or general report is not completely straightforward. So all the work that we did talking about and trying to explain the issues around the Holtham formula, relative need, etc., you could argue is either sort of thematic or a general view of the adequacy of the resources and therefore sustainability. So even making that distinction is not entirely straightforward, but we have not felt, constrained in being able to talk about, write about the things that we think are most useful at the time. And I think that still gives us the flexibility to do that.
Well, one further question. Do you, are you content? I know we find a lot of our bills are like enabling powers, and things will get added on later. And there's a clause like that the department made by regulations confer additional functions to the council. But in terms of the scrutiny role that the council, I mean, first of all, do you see this as increasing your powers and your level of scrutiny? And secondly, as it's worded, do you think it will be sufficient to have a challenge function at time and to be able to speak out if you are concerned about how departments and the executive generally is spending public money?
Yes, I don't see any particular difficulty with the right to speak out and the right to publish what you want to publish without it being muzzled by a department or departments, or indeed being muzzled by the UK government if we're in a situation where the UK government is setting the budget. I think that is reassuring on that front. Access to information is the area where, when working relationships have broken down or got difficult in other institutions of this sort, that things can get more difficult. And the idea of being able to sort of fall back on legislation is generally helpful, but it won't surprise you that the number of fiscal councils that have legal rights to information from their governments that have actually used those rights in anger, right? They pursued them in the courts. I'm aware of it, I think, in Spain, and I'm aware of it in Canada. Is pretty rare. And once you're in the situation where you are having to go to the court or higher authority to enforce those rights, you're already in a very difficult position, and the relationships will have broken down, and that's not a good environment. I think that obviously independence is in the eye of the beholder, and you can have, again, all the guarantees or safeguards for independence you like in legislation, but you establish and make people believe in your independence in the way you do the job day to day, your willingness to speak truth to power. And we've obviously said things, I'm sure, at times that the Department of Finance or other departments have found uncomfortable and have received, not been under any pressure not to do that. And we recognise that also that it's sometimes the information you'd like is not straightforward to provide for reasons that are entirely benign rather than malign. So again, you have to recognise that you're working in an environment which does not have unlimited resources, either in the Fiscal Council or in the people that you might be asking for information from. But it's been one of the pleasures of having done the role over the last 4.5 years has been how supportive and willing departments and public bodies like NI Water, the utility regulator, Department of Health, etc., have been to provide the information that you need on a realistic timetable. You can never take those things for granted. Why it's important to have that statutory foundation. But it's not something that's causing me anxiety at the moment, and doesn't cause me anxiety in the way in which the bill's drafted.
Okay, thank you. Enough. Okay, I think we've probably we've drawn close to the end of this session. No further members have indicated they wish to ask questions. Just a couple of final ones from me. One is on the multi-year budget more generally. I've just had an answer actually in from the Finance Minister on the timing. I think he had indicated that we would expect it before Christmas. I don't think we can be certain that it's going to be before Christmas. That's not, I'm not putting words in anybody's mouth. The answer indicates, and we'll share it with members for their information, that once we have the UK budget next Wednesday, after that, but he doesn't say, the answer does not say whether it's an hour after that, a day after that, or a month after that, the budget will be brought to the multi-year budget, I hope, will be brought to the executive for agreement. Can I just ask, have the Fiscal Council had much contact from the department on what's in the multi-year budget? Have you seen a version of it, first of all?
No, and I think, as you say, I would expect that, understandably, there's a whole lot of decisions that people are not going to want to take until they've seen the UK budget, and in particular, obviously, whether there are any positive or negative Barnett consequentials coming out of decisions on public spending. Are there going to be, is there going to be additional resource at the UK level to, help address pay issues in the near term? Is there going to be, downward adjustments to the departmental spending totals for further years in order, along with potential tax increases, to contribute to strengthening the fiscal position more broadly? So I'm, entirely unsurprised that everybody is going to be waiting to see what is in the UK government UK government budget to see what your prospective block grant envelopes are for the following years. There's obviously, in terms of getting to agreement on a budget at the executive level, there is the challenge, as we know, that the Department of Health has already had to be given authority to spend more than was originally budgeted for. There will be decisions, therefore, that need to be taken about whether that, plus any additional pressures, can be accommodated from other areas of the current year budget, whether you're in a situation where you're going to be overspending. If you are in a situation where you're going to overspending, that would, other things being equal, imply a reduction in the block grant for the following year. And that could obviously clearly complicate the task of reaching agreement on a budget over a 3 and 4 year horizon. So I think I am assuming that both knowing what's coming out of the UK budget and getting a fuller appreciation of what the impact, in particular, of the pay pressures is on the overall budget position, and the executive's room for manoeuvre is certainly not all set in stone yet.
I suppose I am slightly surprised in that, if I suppose the understanding of what's coming out of the UK government budget is not, and I don't think we've had any indication that it will meaningfully transform the totals that were in the June spending review. So, I mean, I was kind of operating on the assumption, it turns out to have been a flawed assumption, that they would have produced a multi-year budget kind of by now. Then if there were any in-year 25-26 adjustments, ideally obviously additional Barnett's, great, that could be, those would be allocated via a December monitoring round. But the multi-year budget, would be largely based on the totals from the spending review.
Yeah, I mean, well, obviously from this standpoint, I don't know how heavily penciled in, if not yet inked in, potential plans are over that period. Clearly, as I say, if you're in a situation in which you have, an overspend this year that has to be compensated for in a subsequent year, that presents non-trivial planning issues and debates over where the resource comes from. So you may be right. Maybe much more has been penciled in, and there are just a couple of I's and T's to be dotted and T's to be crossed. But we wouldn't, we're not feeling deprived that we should at this stage have been given a lot more information about what a 3-year or multi-year budget should look like. We would expect to know that, once the executive has agreed that. Obviously, the department is, very helpful in, providing, what useful background it has. But, I'm conscious from, even the relatively limited periods I've been looking at Northern Ireland budgets of the challenges of getting those things agreed and actually having something that everybody's willing to put their names behind.
Okay, and just on that point, Sir Robert and Jonathan, if you wish, on the I guess planned overspend, which has been agreed by the executive. The finance minister were very keen to point out that it was agreed by the executive. It wasn't just him giving the health minister permission. He was very keen to say that is, obviously we have overspends and underspends all the time, and we have had situations in which departments have particularly when the institutions were down, departments have overspent, and then that led to some of the reserve claim issues that existed that had to be dealt with at restoration. But are you concerned by the decision to I should say, I think most people want pay parity very much to be met, and is a key priority, and something that's been politically agreed for a long time, but obviously it hasn't been budgeted in at the beginning of years. Are you concerned at the approach of, rather than budgeting in the pay parity at the start of the year and dealing with the consequence then, in the middle of the year, kind of saying, effectively, well, we'll stick it on the credit card and we'll worry about it next year. And of course, part of worrying about it next year means you've also got to deal with the challenge of the pay settlement for next year, as well as all the other pressures. Are you concerned about that approach?
Well, I think not necessarily in principle. I mean, if you think about, if all you were talking about was there is a £100 million overspend in one department, then obviously there's the question: does that automatically translate into a 100 million overspend at the executive level as a whole? I think obviously one concern would be that, having felt the need to move on pay in health, maybe you see similar challenges confronting other departments in charge of other public services. We know that there are some other pressures as well. So obviously, if that were part of a larger potential overspending problem, then the danger is that you're back into the sorts of debates that we've had in recent years about how best to approach that. I think on the pay parity point, there is the fundamental issue that if the UK government provides an X% increase in pay and provides some extra money for that in terms of the departmental expenditure limits at the UK level, the way the Barnett formula works is that does not generate enough money for the executive, all other things being equal, to pay the same percentage pay increase in Northern Ireland, because the public sector is larger and the pay mix is less favourable. So I think the question of actually saying, well, look, there is always likely to be a choice, and it's a less severe choice than it was because of the 24% uplift to future Barnett consequentials. But being in a situation where that the block grant increase resulting from a UK pay deal is not going to be enough to provide that in parity unless you find the money from elsewhere in the executive budget, that's a fact of arithmetic that needs to be faced up to. If you have a decision to match a pay deal that is not fully financed by the additional Barnett consequentials, that is not a one-off cost like a data breach that you might have to pay for. It's something which is going to add in to the spending pressures in every future year. And if you have an addition to spending pressures in this year that flow through into every other year, the appropriate response to that is not to borrow from next year to do it in the current year. That is essentially, it's scratching the itch this year, to go back to our metaphor, but making the itch itchier in the year to follow. So I think, I do have a concern that, the willingness to have an open conversation about, well, if we are going to have pay parity in these sorts of situations, the money's got to come from somewhere. It's not going to come automatically from Barnett consequentials. So Are we discussing properly the alternative ways of doing that? Can we get it from elsewhere in the executive budget? Do you need more revenue in order to be doing that? There is a choice to be made here, and just saying we're going to fund it by potentially taking some money from next year is just kicking that can down the road.
I think that point is well made, and I think that's one of the questions we will want to discuss in the multi-year budget, whether any other choices are being made to raise more revenue locally, or to seek more fiscal powers, or to do anything that might change the kind of same old fiscal conversation. But Fiscal Council have been a huge part of improving the fiscal conversation here. So thank you very much for that. No one else has indicated they wish to ask a question. So I would just make one plea, which is we may not see you again before Christmas. Obviously, have a great Christmas and Happy New Year to both Sir Robert and Jonathan, but also assuming we get, and hoping and praying, if you're religious, we'll not go down that road today, we've got more, that's for other committees, we have a executive budget, multi-year budget before the end of the year. We would very much like, obviously, and would expect the Fiscal Council to be back with us to talk about that budget at your earliest convenience, ideally early in the new year, assuming we have the multi-year budget before the end of this year. So hoping to see you then, and obviously any further questions about the bill that come up. In the meantime, we'll keep in touch. Thank you both, Sir Robert.
Yeah, certainly if we, I would join your prayers or non-religious supplications that we have something nice to be able to comment on.
Well, indeed, yes. Maybe it'll be underneath the Christmas tree for absolute geeks who don't have anything better to do on Christmas Day. But anyway, thank you both. We'll hear from you soon.
Good to see you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Cheers, bye.
Bye.
Members, so there's loads more to discuss that we didn't get round to. Obviously, we'll discuss the bill and the multi-year budget with Sir Robert and Jonathan, but we will obviously have the opportunity to talk about that in more detail whenever we have the multi-year budget. Excuse me. So, members, we're now going to move on. We've got a very brief conversation. We're actually, believe it or not, ahead of time. We are moving on to agenda item 9, which is the Administrative and Financial Provisions Bill Committee deliberations. Members, the committee agreed to commission legal advice on limitations on the scope of the bill. We have now got that advice, which is in your packs. So we're going to go into closed session if we haven't done it already.
Spinning. Oh, there we go.
Great. Okay, members, we were in closed session getting legal advice relating to the Administrative and Financial Provisions Bill. A couple of actions. We're going to write again to other departments, other committees, highlighting the breadth of the scope of this bill, the fact that we would anticipate there will be significant numbers of amendments. We don't know whether they will all be accepted, but it is true to say that while we are primary scrutiny committee of this bill and are doing our job in terms of what's on the face of the bill, they need to be mindful, as we've already said to them before, of their measures or things that will directly affect their department and its statutory responsibilities and its finances, but also supplementary amendments may be received or may be submitted at any point. We won't see a marshalled list before we have completed our committee stage, so we do not anticipate having the bandwidth to provide a detailed report on every potential amendment, and it wouldn't be, I think, an effective use of our time. So we'd simply make the point to other committees, which and via committees, individual MLAs and indeed their party groups, that they should be ready to do significant scrutiny on their own stead on any potential amendments and take a view on them, because this committee is unlikely to have the bandwidth to do all of that. But in addition to that, we will reach out to the Finance Minister to ask if he is minded to prepare any additional amendments. We know that they've clarified they're not going to, Clause 20 is not going to be moved.
Clause 20 is going to be removed.
And the Education Minister has indicated he may bring an amendment, so it would be helpful to understand if the Finance Minister is minded to bring any other amendments. And we are also in closed session a brief discussion about evidence in the Fiscal Council bill, which is progressing at pace, and we had two very useful evidence sessions today. We're going to reach out again to two of the people from the think tank world, namely Pivotal and Nevin, to see if they would like to join the evidence session with the Ulster University Economic Policy Centre to give their view, not necessarily just on the technicalities of independent fiscal institutions, but on what contribution this should make or could make to the broader Northern Ireland policy debate. So I think we'll do that and reach out to them and see if they're able to participate. I think that would be helpful on both of those things. So that's our agreements on that. Okay, members, we're now just going to move on very quickly, I hope, to correspondence. Yes?
No, we've still got a bit here, Chair.
We've still got a bit. Okay, yes. Sorry, members, page 145 of the meeting pack. There's a response to queries raised by the committee on the 24th of September. Just in summary, we had requested information on a chronological breakdown on when each of the bill's provisions were added, clarification on any of the bill's provisions and whether they nullify or set aside any existing powers, clarification on whether the 2% limit to advances has been reached or breached or close to reached, detail of any discussions with the UK Government over the bill's provisions, and more detail of the boardroom apprentice scheme. Members, does anyone wish to talk about any of this or seek further clarification? Deputy Chair, yeah.
I think that there's some really good detail, Chair, in this, and just suppose maybe we'll revisit it in another session.
Sounds good. Yeah, agreed. Okay, so members, page 156 of the meeting pack, there's correspondence from the Executive Office Committee, regarding the child's rights screening process. Yes, okay, sorry, I should have said that. So this information, members, will be added. The information we've just discussed, that's at page 145 onwards, will be added to the committee stage and in the e-bill. So members are agreed we'll copy that information to the relevant statutory committees. Agreed. Page 156 of the meeting pack has correspondence from the Executive Office Committee regarding child's rights screening and the process undertaken related to the bill. Members will recall this was an issue raised in correspondence from the Children's Commissioner. The Department of Finance has sent us some comments, and these were considered on the 1st of October and sent to the Children's Commissioner. The response will be added to the evidence base in the committee stage of the bill. If members are content. Now, members, also note the Hansard transcript for the raised briefing from last week's meeting at page 219. This will also be added to the evidence base for the committee stage of the bill in the bill folder. Members are content. Now, finally, we move on, not quite finally, but we move on to correspondence. 10.1 is from the Consumer Council, and it's the report on transport and food accessibility for rural consumers. That's at page 230. That's to note, unless anybody wishes to raise anything on it. 10.2 to 10.4 is Hansard transcripts. Members, Hansard transcripts have been published for evidence session on the Public Office Accountability Bill, the consultation on divorce and dissolution of civil partnerships, and the evidence session with the OECD and the NI Fiscal Council Bill. All these will be added to the relevant bill folders and evidence bases in due course. 10.5 is the Examiner of Statutory Rules, 50th report. Nothing for us in it. 10.6 is the Association of British Insurers. At page 265, there's a press release from the ABI which indicates that whilst claim pressures remain high, insurance premiums across the UK continue to fall in 2025. So that's PR on behalf of their members, but that's fair enough. Agenda item 11 is draft forward work programme. That's at page 269. The clerk will briefly run through that for us.
Yeah, Chair, we've got pinned down in an oral briefing from LPS around the rating policy SL1s. Members will recall we get four rating policy SL1s around this time. Those will cover various bits and pieces, but we have those up on the 3rd of December. The briefing was meant to be early in this, but they're hoping that they will have an indication of budget by that stage, so that's why we're moving it to then. And then we have agreed today, Chair, to look and see if we can get Nevin and Pivotal up when we have the UUEPC on the 3rd as well.
Is it going to be helpful for clarity in terms of the policy debate?
And just to remind members, we have Minister up on the 10th, and we'll be forwarding the list that we have with the additions from members to them probably tomorrow.
Okay, members are happy enough with those amendments to the forward work programme, and also members were working on a draft forward work programme from the new year onwards. So if members are agreed that we will have to have, this is going to be unpopular here, this is before Scrooge, like we're going to have some earlier meeting starts at 1 p.m. in order to fit in our work, particularly given bill scrutiny. I'm aware that does present challenges, including for members who are coming a distance. But our members agreed that we will do that for a short period, a short burst. And bear in mind, we're not starting immediately on January 1st.
No. Our first meeting in January, Chair, just to remind members, 14th will be down at LPS. Now that will start at 12:30.
No, I was just saying we'll keep it live. So if there's a later meeting, or if someone brought, we won't just, and I'm very keen on this, we won't just leave it in at 1 p.m. as a kind of like, as headroom in case we need it. We'll have it as one, and I will endeavour to finish in early time. Are members content that we put it in as for now, and then if we change it, we have to? Deputy Chair?
That's for the new year.
For the new year.
For these next couple.
Not for the next couple.
Okay.
No.
Yeah. If members are content, okay. My Scrooge, okay. But as I say, it will be reviewed. So if we need to change it back to, if we can change it back to 2, we will. I appreciate. Obviously, members have to get further distance than me. So if members are content, we'll put that on the committee webpage. Agenda item 12, is any other business? Is there any business? Deputy Chair.
Yeah, Chair, I had raised with you, I wonder next week, so we'll have obviously the budget. Will there be any opportunity for a readout or anything from officials or some sort of communication in advance? If I would presume the Minister will have some sort of a statement on Monday or Tuesday on the back of the budget. So I just was wondering in terms of committee and once the budget comes through, if there's any opportunity for us to get some sort of briefing.
It's a good point. So it's on Wednesday, and it's usually what happens if you're like the last one. We remember Shooty Ulster when they did the spending review. Generally, what happens is they do it, and say both from experience in this committee and indeed my old life a decade ago when I was like, they generally don't give, like, for better or worse. I think mostly for worse actually, they don't give the devolves really any notice. So in fairness to the Minister and his officials, they won't see any of that. They won't get like an embargoed briefing on this. They will literally get it. Pretty much in real time, and they'll get they'll then get a bit more information from the relevant counterparts in the Treasury. I'm not totally sure we can expect a briefing from them next Wednesday. I'm always keen to get more rather than less briefings. We can ask the question whether they're able to give us anything next Wednesday, even if it's in written form in real time. If Joanne wants to come in and talk to us, we could definitely should accommodate her, but I don't think it's...
Sorry, Chair, not necessarily on Wednesday, but I just mean in the days following in advance of something hitting the chamber, just for a comprehensive understanding.
Chair, I recall last time the department did provide the committee with a readout. It was a letter from the Minister prior to any statement being made. So I think that would be, I think to be clear, I think that would be really helpful. Yes, I think we should ask for a kind of the earliest possible readout in written form on consequences for here. Yeah. Members are content that we ask for that? Yeah. Next is the adjournment to our date, time and place of next meeting, which is here at 2 p.m, when we will actually have seen what's in the budget, and we can talk about it a little bit at the beginning of the meeting, based on what we have, and we can ask for further information from the department as required. But until then, I will put the question: the committee adjourned. Meeting's now adjourned. Thanks, everyone.